ComStar is an organization with a rich history and a storied past. From its humble beginnings as a communications department, serving the needs of the inner sphere, to its role as a powerful political and military force. ComStar has played an integral role in shaping the course of human history. Founded in the aftermath of the Star League era, ComStar was initially established as a means of maintaining the flow of information across a vast expanse of space that separated the various worlds of the inner sphere. However, as the political climate of the inner sphere grew increasingly tense, ComStar's role began to evolve, ultimately culminating in the organization's new destiny as mediator, religious institution, and even a military power. Today, the legacy of ComStar lives on, as the organization's influence continues to be felt throughout the inner sphere and beyond. Join us as we explore the history of ComStar, from its origins to its pivotal role in the events leading up to the clan invasion. A long and often twisted history that started with a single man. It was 2739. In the small town of Galesburg, North America, a child prodigy was born, Jerome Blake, a young man with a passion for engineering. From a young age, he showed an interest in hyperpulse mathematics and physics, and spent much of his time studying. He was a loner, a social introvert, but his dedication paid off when he graduated from the University of Lamprecht at the young age of 16. Blake's talent did not go unnoticed, and so he was recruited by HPG personal provider Starlight Broadcasting Ltd. He was placed on permanent assignment to the Star League's Department of Communications, where he quickly rose through the ranks to become the lead operations officer for Class A station on the Terran hegemony world of Oliver. In the year 2766, Blake was on holiday in the Free Worlds League when disaster struck. Stefan Amaris launched his coup against the Star League, and chaos ensued. Blake, luckily, managed to avoid capture by Amaris forces, but the situation was dire nonetheless. As the highest-ranking technician of a few remaining personnel, Blake knew he had to act. He volunteered to assist the Star League Defense Force. General Alexander Kerensky therefore assigned Blake and his handful of technicians to devise a method for using the remaining Class B HPG stations of the inner sphere that were not under Amaris control. Later, during the SLDS Rim Worlds campaign, Blake and his team established a makeshift crime circuit, using the HPGs that Amaris did not control. These became the main method for communication, used by the SLDF and the Great Houses, allowing them to bypass Amaris and his forces. As the campaign approached Terra, Blake once again stepped up to lead the teams that re-established communications in recaptured HPG stations. This allowed the SLDF to manage their forces more easily during these offensives. But it was not without risk. During the recapture of the Dieron HPG station, Amaris forces broke through the SLDF lines and fired on the station, killing 3 technicians and injuring Blake critically. Although his cognitive abilities were not impaired, Blake would suffer from short comas late in life, presumably due to these injuries. With the defeat of Amaris forces in the liberation of Terra, Blake turned his attention to the daunting task of restoring communications in the inner sphere. He focused on the construction of a Hilton Head HPG complex, located on Hilton Head Island in the ancient region of South Carolina. It had been overlooked by Amaris forces and was vital for making Terra the center of the HPG network once again. In 2779, Jerome Blake made it his HQ and the main hub for the whole organization. Blake's skill and reputation for integrity did not go unnoticed. On October 10, 2780, Nicoletta Calderon nominated him for the position of Minister of Communications of the Star League, a proposal he was totally unaware of. The nomination was quickly agreed upon by the High Council. It was the only matter the House Lords ever agreed upon, making him the only existing minister of Star League. As a result, Blake found himself at the helm of a reconstruction effort for the entire Terran hegemony. As a Minister of Communications, Blake was increasingly pushed into the role of informal government for the shattered hegemony. He continually pressed the Council Lords to name a former successor, but they were too busy preparing for war and directed Blake to do so how he saw fit. Blake's main responsibility now was the rebuilding of Terra and to help the rest of the hegemony, a task he again performed marvelously. By 2782, most of Terra's population was housed and fed. It was also in this year that the administration completely moved from Unity City to Hilton Head Island. The old court should not be used again until a new High Lord of Starleague was named. But all hopes were shattered, and soon the collapse of the Terran hegemony and the Starleague seemed unavoidable. So on November 2nd, 2783, Blake privately met with Alexander Kerensky and his son Nicholas at the SLDF post-coup headquarters on New Earth. Blake thanked Kerensky for his support in driving away the great houses, what allowed him to proceed with his efforts unhindered. He was hoping to rely on his friend in the future. But Kerensky had a different plan in mind. He revealed his refusal to seize the throne of the Starleague or to try and defend the hegemony from house attacks. Instead, he proposed a third option: exodus. While Jerome Blake was furious upon learning of Kerensky's intentions, pointing out the misery and bloodshed it would allow, the general insisted that it was the only way to avoid a much greater loss of life. Despite his attempts to sway Kerensky into staying, Blake agreed to help keep the secret of the operation. He was able to convince Kerensky to ask some of the troops who declined to join Operation Exodus to assist the department's reconstruction efforts. On November 5th, 2784, Kerensky and his Exodus fleet left the sphere, starting a chain of events which would have terrible repercussions in the inner sphere and elsewhere. Kerensky was a fool in many ways. The existence of the accursed clans is proof of his divine madness. The word of Blake views Kerensky as the man who single-handedly destroyed the Starleague when he abandoned the inner sphere forever, taking most of the Starleague army with him. Holding these troops as a last resort, Blake continued to focus on the rebuilding of the HPG network. Just 3 days after the Exodus, he was able to re-establish First Circuit HPGs on New Earth, Barnard, Alpha C, Bryant, Procyon, and Dieron. These stations were the most central hubs of a full HPG network, and it was only natural to form the chief administrators of those HPGs into a decision-making council for the whole organization. While the prime administrator was their chair and president, they were able to veto him with a majority decision. They would share the name First Circuit with their HPGs. Blake recognized two great responsibilities in the wake of the collapse of Starleague: preserving as much of the currently available technological knowledge as possible, and preventing the successor states from seizing the interstellar communications network and misusing it for their own destructive purposes. To this end, he set about transforming the Department of Communications into a neutral, transnational corporation dedicated to the operation and preservation of the HPG network. Two other important events happened in this time. In 2785, Konrad Toyama became Chief Administrator of Dieron HPG, and therefore member of the First Circuit, a position he immediately used to push for a name change. The organization should from now on be known under the name ComStar. There are two explanations for the name. The more secular one says that ComStar is a combination of Communications Enterprise Incorporated and Starlight Broadcasting Ltd., two companies which had sold their services and HPG equipment to Starleague. The more mystical variant is that Toyama had received the vision of Richard Cameron's Shade right after accidentally getting a high-voltage shock, and it was the soul of the deceased ruler that gave him a new name. For the next 2 years, ComStar worked tirelessly on Terra and the shattered worlds of the hegemony, along with the HPG network. Despite Blake's amazing efforts, the growing storm clouds of war hung over all ComStar had achieved, and his deepest fears were that the House Lord's lust for power would destroy everything he had rebuilt. He knew that for economical, social, military, and prestige reasons, Terra would be the most sought-after prize of the whole sphere. In the winter of 2786, Jerome Blake held a secret meeting with the First Circuit to discuss the protection of Terra and the HPG network. His plan had 3 key parts: to persuade the leaders of the great houses to agree on the neutrality of ComStar, its facilities, and personnel; to formalize the ComStar letter of credit as a common currency for exchange with all great houses; and finally, to seize Terra and as many of the surrounding worlds of a hegemony as possible in the name of ComStar. Despite initial skepticism, Blake was able to persuade all members of First Circuit to back his endeavor. The name: Operation Silver Shield. In 2787, Blake embarked on a historic tour of the inner sphere. His goal? To convince each House Lord to sign the Communications Protocol and secure ComStar's neutrality. Blake displayed great diplomatic skills and a willingness to bend the truth to achieve his goals. By claiming that other lords had already signed the protocol, he tried to force all of the successor states into compliance. His efforts finally paid off, as each House Lord signed the protocol, believing that they were the last to do so. The First Circuit of ComStar was amazed by Blake's success and offered their full support for the remainder of Operation Silver Shield. However, by the time Blake returned to Terra, open warfare had already begun. This forced Blake to revise the third part of Silver Shield, stripping the surrounding worlds of all useful resources and focusing on the capture of Terra alone. On June 25th, 2788, ComStar made a bold move by shutting down all of its hyperpulse generators. 8 divisions, disguised as mercenaries, successfully defeated the House and former SLDF units which opposed Blake's control over the Sol system. After 72 hours, the HPG network resumed transmission, broadcasting scenes of a military takeover of Terra. The entire operation was filmed and documented by the orders of Blake in the First Circuit. The footage, intended to impress the House Lords into accepting ComStar's ownership of Terra. Blake would also transmit a short message to the entire inner sphere. People of the former Star League, I am Jerome Blake, Prime Administrator of ComStar. As of now, 0900 hours Terran Standard Time, military forces under my direct command have seized control of the Sol star system. ComStar is now officially in control of Terra and all former Star League facilities remaining in the system. From this time forward, I proclaim Terra and the entire Sol system as neutral under the protection of ComStar, under the terms and conditions of the Communications Protocol of 2787. As the previous broadcast has made clear, ComStar has sufficient military force to defend the home world of mankind from any aggressor. Our goals are peaceful. We seek the unity and prosperity of mankind. This action was taken to save lives in the devastating war that is unfolding. ComStar will continue to offer its communication services to all member states, as long as the Sol system and our neutrality are honored. Following the successful takeover of Terra, Blake officially declared ComStar's neutrality and established the organization as the custodian of the HPG network. He also established the ComStar letter of credit as a common currency for exchange with all great houses for ComStar services. Blake's bold plan had successfully protected Terra and the HPG network from the savages and ravages of war. but his actions also marked the beginning of ComStar's transformation from a reconstruction organization into a powerful and influential political entity in the inner sphere. Despite his success, Blake remained concerned about the potential destruction of his efforts by the great houses, ongoing conflicts, and worked to maintain ComStar's neutrality and protect the HPG network throughout his tenure as prime administrator of ComStar. Truly, Jerome Blake was a man of many talents, not only a technician but also an administrator and businessman with a mind for political economy. In the early days of ComStar, the organization struggled to stay afloat as they embarked on massive reconstruction projects in the hegemony. But through his cunning and determination, Blake managed to pay off all the debts to the other states that they had accumulated over the last years, and was even able to turn a first profit for ComStar amid the chaos of the First Succession War in 2802. Another danger appeared in the spring of 2811, when the treacherous Chancellor Liao sought to bolster her realm's weakening grip on technology. She sent her lackeys to bribe ComStar's own technicians, hoping to turn them against their oaths and to bring the mighty HPG network to its knees. But the brave souls of ComStar stood strong, foiling the first attempt by unidentified terrorists to seize control of an HPG station on the Capellan world of Nanking. Though Liao denied any involvement, the First Circuit saw through her lies and uncovered the true nature of her scheme. But ComStar would not be undone so easily. The Prime Administrator proposed the creation of a covert force to protect the network from all manner of threats, both from within and without. And thus, ROM was born. A covert security force with far-reaching abilities and permissions. A secret organization embedded in the ranks of the technical personnel and the citizenship. The mission was to protect the HPG network and other ComStar assets, to prevent the leakage of information and the defection of ComStar members, and to eliminate every threat against ComStar. This shadowy organization reported directly to Blake, and within a year it had grown into a force to be reckoned with. It had spread not only to all of the inner sphere, but had a very pronounced focus on the Capellan Confederation. So when Rom uncovered a plot by the Confederation to slay Robin Bishop, chief administrator of Brian HPG, Blake ordered them to strike first and eliminate the Capellan assassins before they could carry out their foul deed. And so it was done, with all the assassins dead within 2 days. At the same time, Blake sent a warning to Liao. The ComStar now had the means to defend itself from any and all aggressors. The Chancellor, wise enough to know when she was beaten, ordered her Mashkirovka to bend the plans to attack ComStar. The HPG network stood strong, protected by the might of Rom and the leadership of Jerome Blake. Soon Rom was also used to internally enforce the policy of the First Circuit, a task it pursued with ruthless determination, earning it a dire reputation. Because with every passing year, Blake got more and more distrustful. It became his belief that ComStar had to retain its purity by isolating itself from the outside world. Any member who discussed technological subjects with outsiders, even very simple ones, would be severely punished and could be expelled from ComStar. At the operational level, the First Circuit now banned all non-members from its meetings and adopted a culture of extreme secrecy. Knowledge and information were turned into secrets, assets that had to be guarded at all costs and shared with as few people as possible. In his last years, Jerome Blake spent less time with the daily administration of ComStar and instead focused on his philosophical pursuits, attended by a devout group of his followers, including Konrad Toyama. With time, Blake also became more and more of a mystic. He saw the decline of civilization as a form of divine punishment for the collected sins of mankind. All knowledge would be lost if no one would take up the task of preserving it for the future of mankind. For him, this was the real purpose of ComStar, and he tried to preserve as much technology as possible and to keep the communication network out of the hands of successor states. This, Jerome Blake considered to be ComStar's highest purpose, the maintenance and preservation of human knowledge. In May 2819, during a meeting with the First Circuit, Blake fell ill, but his comrades were not overly worried, as he seemed to recover quickly. But alas, fate had other plans. Later that month, the sickness returned, and this time it was deemed a fatal affliction. He spent his remaining days being visited by the members of the First Circuit, one by one, until Toyama was the last to see him. He stayed with him for almost 3 hours and was at his side when he passed away, around midnight, as he later testified. With Blake's passing, Toyama emerged from the master's chamber, announcing his death and presenting a writ, signed by Blake, that declared Konrad Toyama to be the next Prime Administrator of ComStar. None questioned the document, and he immediately received the confirmation of the First Circuit. When it comes to telling a story, true or fictitious, two things have to be kept in mind. The first is that humans hate the color gray with a passion. They love the bright openness of white, its ethereal beauty and the image of light and good that it carries. And they equally are eager to forgive black, this brooding and intimidating shade. But gray? Never. The same is also true when it comes to the metaphorical level. The people want the heroes and villains, characters they can love or hate with all their soul, good and evil, nice and bad, white and black. However, by virtue of being humans themselves, few, if any, persons can be classified this easy. Good people have their vices and mistakes, evildoers their good sides and valid reasons. We therefore have to call them morally gray. Yet, since the audience insists on the shunning of gray, most presenters will start to bend the truth a little and to readjust some traits and actions. No, not the king was evil. His prime minister is responsible. No, not the emperor caused the corruption. It was his failure of son. No, the Sublime was not a vain and murderous monster that purged the country. His former partner and later enemy is to blame. Heroes must be heroes, villains must be villains. No gray allowed. The other thing is that complicated situations are bad. People quickly lose the overview, get confused, and then start having problems to follow the events. They become frustrated, turn to anger, and finally stop listening altogether. To hold them captive, the narrative has to stay on a low level, like a sitcom or a telenovela. So if they ask you, who was it? The worst kind of answer would be, actually, it was a complicated and prolonged process. You are supposed to name exactly one person, one individual to shoulder all the responsibility. And for ComStar, this person is Konrad Toyama. Not only has to be the dark counterpart to the shining hero Jerome Blake, the opposition and his critics have painted him in such grim colors that he shields others, more vicious characters, against accusations as well. Who was Konrad Toyama? Born on 9th September 2752 and raised on the Terran hegemony world of Styx, Konrad Toyama had a relatively mundane childhood. But his life immediately changed at age 14 when Stefan Amaris launched his coup. By all accounts, he was a charming and fast-talking rogue who truly prospered during the occupation as a fixer and fence, orchestrating black market deals and bribing the occupation forces to turn a blind eye to his business. But then the Draconis Combine took control of Styx in 2772, Toyama's dealings became more complicated. The same was when the Star League Defense Forces followed in August of 2773. Both were far less willing to ignore his dealings. So, in order to make ends meet, Toyama had to look for a new customer. Given the disdainful attitude of the SLDF troops against him, he started to work for Blake's Department of Communication in 2774. His ability to acquire rare components and notable skill at jury rigging soon turned him into untrusted help of a team tasked with restoring Styx's disabled hyperpulse generator. Thanks to his effort and engagement, the repairs could be finished in only half the expected time. By 2780, he had officially joined the department and worked directly with Jerome Blake. Toyama's mix of commercial and technical knowledge, along with his natural charm, earned him the respect of Blake, who selected the young man for the important post of Chief Administrator Biron Hyperpulse Generator in 2785, giving him a position on the newly created First Circuit, the decision-making council for the department made up by the HPG's First Circuit's Chief Administrators. As already mentioned, Toyama was the instigator for creating the name ComStar by combining Communications Enterprises Incorporated and Starlight Broadcasting Ltd. Into a new name. Or, depending on your own preferences, by receiving the name from the ghost of Richard Cameron. At first, just one of Blake's many advisors, Toyama's talents and charm allowed him to become Blake's principal aide and confidant. Although never previously a religious person, Toyama was so impressed by Blake's relentless drive to restore the HPG network, his cunning manipulation of the great houses into signing the communications protocol of 2787, and the success of Operation Silver Shield, that he became to regard Blake as a kind of prophet and sage, displaying unquestionable loyalty and following every command with an almost religious favor. When the elderly Blake began to increasingly withdraw from the day-to-day business of the organization as his health declined from 2814, the relationship cooled a bit, and some distance developed between them. Yet Toyama would continue to visit him, usually at Blake's private retreat in the foothills of the Green Mountains. When Blake lay on his deathbed in 2819, it was only natural that his trusted friend and follower would be among those who visited him. But it is precisely this meeting that is surrounded by legend, conspiracy, and accusations. Only little do we know for certain. Toyama was the only one present. Steps were taken to muffle listening devices and block the security cameras hidden in the Prime Administrator's room. In total, Toyama spent more than 3 hours together with him before he emerged and announced that Jerome Blake had died at the stroke of midnight, while carrying a last will naming him as successor to the position of Prime Administrator. No one questioned Toyama's claims. The First Circuit confirmed him immediately. The question is, what happened during the meeting? In broad strokes, there are two different theories, two explanations, two legends. There is the dark one, spread by adversaries of ComStar, critics, and, interesting enough, secular ComStar itself. It stresses that there were major disagreements between Blake and Toyama, like the decision of the former to sell non-military goods to the successor states. The tampering of the surveillance equipment is blamed on Toyama, combined with the implication that he used this opportunity to assist in Blake's death. Of course, he then had to play the role of a grieving and lost follower. In effect, this narrative claims that Konrad Toyama used murder and manipulation to pull off a takeover of ComStar. All the following reforms and changes are therefore to be blamed on him, including the transformation of a political organization, ComStar, into a religious blessed order. The shining white of Jerome Blake stays untarnished by the vile black of Konrad Toyama. No gray at all. Nice. The other version is the more traditional. It was the official one before the schism and remained the valid one for the word of Blake. Here, Toyama was persuaded by the dying wishes of Blake himself to take the path into mysticism and faith. And it was the old master who, in his last hours, taught the outlines for his plans to Toyama. It should be mentioned that there's also a secret version of this story. A suspicion that it was not a mystic revelation but cold calculation that led to the concept of a religious order. Blake, fearing the collapse of ComStar after his death, saw transforming the organization into a cult as the only way to preserve the knowledge of a Star League for the future. Though Toyama was reluctant at first, he agreed with Blake's idea and followed through with his friend's plan to turn the organization into religion by making a saint out of the founder. For good or ill, this legend puts Blake and Toyama in the same boat. If you reject the Blessed Order, both will be ruthless villains for you. If you approve the Blessed Order, both will be wise heroes for you. But you'll still avoid the nasty gray. As the new Prime Administrator, Konrad Toyama had to start his work immediately. The First Succession War, which had started in 2786, was still going on and should only end in 2821. During his Blake lifetime, ComStar's neutrality was never openly challenged, but some officials were becoming discontent. With a new leadership, they saw their chance for change coming. To stop this movement, Toyama made the first step towards faith. He claimed that the dying Blake had warned him about high-ranking traitors in the ranks of ComStar, who were eager to destroy the beliefs and ideals of the organization. Beliefs and ideals he had constructed out of the journals and notes of Jerome Blake. He presented a prediction, elevated to the rank of prophecy, of a future in which the House Lords had exhausted all their resources and power. An inner sphere turned into desolation and ashes by its own greed and madness. Only then would ComStar rise. Like a phoenix, it would rise and rekindle the light of reason and the flame of knowledge, as enlightened theocracy to lead mankind into a bright and peaceful future. It is this vision that became the foundation of ComStar as a faith, and it shaped many of its plans and actions in the future. The main adversary and representative of the opposition was Hermann Schweppes, administrator of New Earth. His faction wanted to leave the shadows and start an all-out war against the successor states. Using the mothballed equipment and the enormous production capacity of Earth, which should allow them to take the worlds of the old Terran hegemony from the occupying houses. In a second step, this realm would allow them to destroy all the successor states. With Blake gone, they were eager to take over ComStar and start their conquest. In July 2819, a draft was presented to the First Circuit. Not only demanded it the activation of all available military assets, but also that the control over ROM was to be transferred from the Prime Administrator to the First Circuit. The following session of the First Circuit can be called the birth of a Blessed Order. For the first time, Toyama shared the prophecy of Jerome Blake with the circuit. He presented the holy mission of ComStar as savior of mankind, and the unavoidable destruction of the great houses by their own hands. He revealed that ComStar had a sacred duty that only true believers deserved to fulfill. Toyama told all this in a marvelous speech and declared that the Journal of Blake, that contained all these revelations, would be published for all to read. Not only to prove his point, but also to be the foundation of a new faith and a holy mission. Konrad Toyama himself admits that after he finished, no one dared to say anything, or even look up for 5 minutes. Was it because they were for the first time confronted with the divine nature of their quest? Or was it because they doubted his mental health? You will have to answer that for yourself. Toyama adjourned the meeting and scheduled the next one to be 2 days later, with the fulfillment of Blake's will and testament as the main point of day. But within less of an hour, he met with Michelle Duprat, the head of ROM and a fellow disciple of Jerome Blake. She almost immediately agreed to support him and organized her agent of the coming events. While there is some disagreement how to call it, it is undisputed what happened next. A purge, a purification, a cleansing, extermination. In less than 48 hours, 4 of the 6 members of the Prime Circuit were assassinated, including Schweppes, who was shot during an attempt to escape, but not before being questioned and giving up the names of all his supporters and allies. The purification of ComStar did not stop at the highest level, but went through the complete organization. Even simple technicians were targeted by ROM and, after found wanting, were sent to re-education camps. Others were marked for death and murdered outright. At the end, 20% of all ComStar personnel was either arrested or killed. And it is a testament to the capabilities of ROM that this all happened in less than a week. The new vacancies were swiftly filled with handpicked supporters of Toyama, all of them ROM members. At the next meeting of the First Circuit, on July 26, 2819, the Prime Administrator presented the transformation of ComStar into the ComStar order. The old hierarchy was to be dismantled and replaced by a new one. Trainees became acolytes, technicians adepts. The planetary administrators changed into presenters. And Toyama was no longer the Prime Administrator, but from now on was the Primus, with Rom as a sentinel guardian, watching over everyone and only beholding to the orders of the Primus. And even more, joining ComStar was no longer a job, but now meant a lifelong commitment. ComStar was now the perfect tool for Blake's vision, and neither House Lords nor internal critics could have stopped it. Toyama's intent behind the coldest change was also to encourage belief that the future of humanity lay in technology and communication between the realms, and that only ComStar could provide. By bestowing the employees of ComStar with a mythical aura of knowledge, Toyama hoped to protect the organization's control of the technology. If only ComStar's adepts could operate ComStar's technology, then even the greedy states would work to protect his people. The Star League's legacy would be safe under ComStar's aegis. With the opposition slain and any doubters in re-education camps or prisons, Toyama's hold on power was absolute. Yet it was clear that the skills of ROM alone would not suffice to keep everything together. Blake's will had to be fulfilled in full, and that meant a religious doctrine and holy scripture to determine the purpose for future generations. Toyama managed to succeed here by keeping his promise. He took the journals and writings of Blake and edited them to a single book. Together with his own comments and explanation, it gave a view into the visions and thoughts of ComStar's founder. Just 4 months after the transformation, he presented this work to the First Circuit, The Word of Blake. It is the foundational text and holy book for all Blakeist beliefs. As required reading, it spread through all of ComStar and gave the members guidelines and goals to strive for. It is, for the most part, a tome of philosophical and mystical musings about the nature of man and the duty against the future, enriched with prophecy and predictions about the fall of the houses, and the destiny of mankind. ComStar's role as guardians of knowledge was now an article of faith, and would indeed outlive the generation of Toyama for centuries. By 2820, the new order was completely under the control of Toyama and his loyalists. The purge of ROM had continued and now even included the service itself, guaranteeing its obedience to the Reformation. And even the elements of the Blakeist faith were further enhanced and refined. The Primus now could afford to handle the outside world. To do so, Toyama embarked on a public tour, visiting the capitals of the great houses and to meet with each of the house lords in the inner sphere. While the professed goal was to explain ComStar's new religious-based organization and structure, it also allowed Toyama to inform the houses about the foiled plans of Schweppes and the prevented attack on all of them. and while he had deposed the perpetrators, the sustained damage made it necessary to demand a 15% increase in transmission rates to rebuild the organization's infrastructure. Save for Archon Richard Steiner of the Lyran Commonwealth, the other House Lords grudgingly accepted the increase with minimal resistance. The Archon, however, refused to make public appearances with Toyama and only agreed to new terms after what he claimed amounted to diplomatic blackmail. Tensions between the Commonwealth and the Blessed Order only increased after this, with the Archon often openly questioning ComStar's neutrality and Toyama's motives, hinting that he suspected the organization as a front for an eventual takeover of the Inner Sphere. Matters escalated when the Archon convinced the Lyran Estates General to pass the Reclamation Act of 2823, which required that ComStar's profit and property be taxed like any other business operating in the Lyran Commonwealth. Toyama knew he had to act fast to prevent any other House Lord to follow suit. Any tarnish on the special status of ComStar would have been a severe damage for its holy quest and position among the successor states. Calling a special session of the First Circuit, Toyama convinced the body to pass the Exclusions of Target Act, ComStar's first communications interdiction against one of the great houses. Shortly before the first tax bill was due, on October 3rd, 2823, a copy of the act was transmitted to Tarkat and delivered to the Archon, followed by the shutdown and disabling of the capital's hyperpulse generator. Before the Archon could even respond, all ComStar personnel were safely evacuated off-world. In one fell swoop, Toyama had shown all the House Lords that he was not afraid to use ComStar's power. The interdiction lasted almost a full year, with little communication between the Commonwealth and ComStar, before the Archon eventually bowed to public pressure in the fall of 2824 and asked the Estates General to rescind the act. Within 72 hours of announcement, the Farkat HPG was receiving and proceeding messages. Right after this, still in the fall of 2824, Toyama made another series of diplomatic visits. An 18-month journey together with several members of the First Circuit followed. But this time they did not go to the world of the Inner Sphere, but visited the periphery. Only few in the Inner Sphere, including Holy Terra itself, were willing to make a lifelong commitment to what many saw as a mystic cult, and the appeal of the word of Blake was quite limited outside ComStar. To increase the reach of the Order and get new talent, new fields of recruitment had to be discovered. Jerome Blake never was a friend of the periphery. His position was somewhere between apathy and open disdain. Maybe because he blamed the periphery uprising for the fall of the Star League, but that is just conjecture. We only know for certain that his focus was on the Inner Sphere, and so this region received all his attention. Konrad Toyama was different. He had no prejudice against the periphery and was willing to welcome its people in the Order. Indeed, the journey was a resounding success. Even if many people remain skeptical about the religious aspect, the chance to improve their own lives and escape the precarious situation was motivation enough for many to join the new Order. The word of Blake offers much more than a means to improve one's material well-being. It provides a direction and purpose. Yes, it is true that we seek to enhance the lot of the less fortunate, but there's more to it than that. Seek the inner peace that only the word of Blake represents. In 2825, a sudden attack by an unknown force, called the Minnesota Tribe, on the Draconis Combine, caused some panic in the Order. Toyama believed that this was a vanguard for Kerensky's troops and immediately tried to make contact with them, but the trace was lost around the Valentinia system. Even Rome failed to gather any meaningful information. It should take more than 2 centuries before ComStar learned about the fate of the exiled SLDF, together with the rest of the sphere. If they sign a lasting treaty, then Blake's vision will be for naught. Their efforts must be smited, and any provisions must be so onerous that renewed warfare and death are preferable. Primus Konrad Toyama, Private Diaries, 2823. In the years after the First Succession War, the violence dropped to a low level as the great houses hurriedly attempted to rebuild and to fix the damage caused by the war. What was good for the suffering people of the sphere was bad news for the prophecies of Blake, and an increasingly dismayed Toyama saw no way for ComStar to reach its full zenith of power unless the successor states went to war again. However, all attempts to reignite the fighting by using misinformation and propaganda failed. In early 2827, this patience was at an end, and Toyama proposed Operation Divine Intervention to the First Circuit. The basic idea was to lure the Draconis Combine into starting another great war. At Toyama's discretion, ROM began to filter information about the inner workings, composition, and movements of both the Draconis Combine Mustard Solderi and the internal security forces to agents of Loki, the Lyran Commonwealth's intelligence agency. While the ComStar News Bureau played up the extent of the raids and tensions along the Free Worlds League and Lyran border, with the LCAF constantly outmaneuvering the Combine thanks to the leaked information. By 2830, an enraged Jinjiro Kurita, already on the verge of madness, launched an all-out offensive against both the Commonwealth and the Federated Suns to restore the honor of his troops. The masterstroke of Toyama's efforts to expand the conflict would prove to be the ComStar War. The Free Worlds League had so far been able to stay out of the conflict, which turned it into a missing piece in this great game. The centerpiece for this intrigue was Janet Merrick. She was the sister of Captain General Charles Merrick and had joined the Order in 2821. Originally, she was supposed to spy for Brother, but under the surveillance and care of Rom, she was indoctrinated and became a quite devout Blakeist. In fact, she used visits to her family to spy for the Order. Her position became even more important when Captain General Charles Merrick tried to use her to gain information about Steiner and Liao. Although the FWL made some gains during the First Succession War, the intelligence agency, SAFE, was utterly devastated. Only very few agents had survived the onslaught of Loki and Maskarovka, and even they suffered a lack of funds. Building a new intelligence network was beyond their abilities. In February of 2830, Captain General Charles Merrick attempted to overcome this problem by asking his sister to use her ComStar ties to provide information about the Lyran and Capellan military. He did not realize that Jeanette would immediately inform the Primus of his request. Recognizing he had an opportunity beyond merely dragging the League into the Second Succession War, Toyama provided her with a document, supposedly from the Lyran High Command, containing plans for the invasion of Graham IV, Castor, and Callison. Jeanette passed on the seemingly important transmission to her brother in mid-June, never questioning its content. Charles refused to accept Lyran denials that such attacks weren't planned and ordered his troops into a state of readiness to launch his own attack against House Steiner, forcing the LCAF to respond in kind, creating the threat the fake documents had claimed. The FWL attack on Schwenkau and Senftenberg in August 2830 marks its entrance into the Second Succession War. The reason behind it was completely based upon the fake informations that Janet Merrick and ComStar had planned. It was only a matter of weeks to turn the complete border between both states into a war zone. Some claim that Toyama intended to guide the FWL down a path of humiliation defeat in order to make Jeanette the next Captain General. However, there is also reason to doubt this part of the story. What is for certain is that the FWL conducted military operations at the whims of ComStar. Between 2831 and 2836, House Merrick won a series of grand military campaigns against House Liao and Steiner thanks to information supplied by ComStar. The information siphoned off by the supposed neutral organization was so important that the other states started to become suspicious. But there were also setbacks and losses which often mirrored their successes. Charles realized this could only be due to his enemies receiving similar leaks. He started to suspect that ComStar was providing likewise aid to his enemies. What he was still lacking was some kind of proof. So, in order to gain certainty, Charles himself leaked intel about an SLDF base discovered on Cursa via ComStar and directly to his sister, all in an effort to expose the Blessed Order's duplicity. The name of the operation was Cookie Jar. On March 15th, 2837, the unimportant and deserted planet Cursa was attacked by 3 elite regiments of Capellan troops. Charles Marek now had evidence for the actions of ComStar. Enraged, he responded by ordering the last warship strike force he had available to destroy the hyperpulse generator on Oriente and to kill all ComStar personnel, including his own sister. Caught completely by surprise, more than 300 people, including Jeanette Marek, died, and the hyperpulse generator was completely destroyed. The following emergency meeting, made by the First Circuit, brought this question to the forefront, and it was discussed how to react against the FWL. Several of the members argued for a military response, but Konrad Toyama had a better, more powerful plan. It was an action that would not cost innocent lives, but could destroy a state during the war. The Free Worlds League has been placed under full communications interdiction for violating the terms and agreements of the Communications Protocol of 2787. Until the League admits its violation and makes proper reparations to ComStar in an amount equal to triple the cost of rebuilding the Oriental Relay Station, all communications into or out other Free Worlds territories or protectorates are hereby suspended. So it is done in the name of the Blessed Blake. Public message to all ComStar HPG stations on late March 2823. A message publicly confirming the interdiction was sent to every station in the inner sphere. Toyama followed this with a private message to all ComStar personnel in the Free Worlds League, ordering them to selectively cripple their HPGs and go into hiding. As Safe and Rom engaged in a desperate shadow war to capture or protect ComStar personnel, House Liao and House Steiner mounted full offensives against the hamstrung Free Worlds League. Both were unaffected by the interdiction. More than a dozen worlds were lost in only 6 months, without any real fight. Liao even gained every planet it had lost in the last 7 years of fighting. Soon, even the houses Davian and Kurita also entered the fray, while the forces of the Captain General dwindled. It all came to an end in August 2838, when the Lyrid Commonwealth prepared for a final push. The Captain General finally caved and sent his youngest son, Garth, to Terra to discuss terms. The following negotiations took until October before conclusion was reached. On November 9th, 2828, the HPG network resumed operations in the FWL. It remained a major power, but the whole sphere had seen the power of ComStar. Konrad Toyama was aware that his life was coming to a close. He played with the idea to retire and even picked his own successor, Raymond Karpov, the administrator of Alpha C, but he never really stepped down. In April 2837, Primus Konrad Toyama had a stroke and passed away in his bed. His remains were cremated and the ash stored in the abandoned court of the Star League. It was of grey color, like ash always is. The Second Succession War was a disaster for the Inner Sphere. While the first one had already destroyed almost all warships and the complete shipbuilding industry, the second one should affect a far wider array of technologies. Not only military research and production, but civil goods and basic necessities as well. When it ended in 2864, the technological level for most successor states had fallen to the primitive level of the 21st century. Besides starships, advanced computers and most kinds of fusion reactors were also turned into lost tech, while both governments and people alike started to salvage, jury, and recycle, just to maintain the little working equipment they still had left. Little did they know that there was a name pegged to their plight: Raymond Karpov. Raymond Andre Karpov was born on Terra, and he not only survived Konrad Toyama's massive purchase of ComStar, but even befriended the presenter Rom, Michel Duprat, eventually rising to the rank of Presenter Alpha C, serving on the Order's first circuit. In April 2837, he became the third Primus of ComStar. Karpov's first act was to name Toyama a Saint of the Blessed Order. Since the death of Toyama had been very sudden, and only a short while after naming Karpov his successor, suspicions of foul play immediately started to appear. A threat that the new Primus countered by taking an extremely hardline approach on all political matters. This included the religious and mystical aspects of Blakeism that were massively enhanced and widened under his rule. For example, had Toyama encouraged the adepts to include hymns and prayers into the handling of HPG machinery. Karpov made this mandatory. He also expanded the range of items that required such rituals and made the use of incantations more and more complex. Usually this took the form of singing passages from the technical readout like a Gregorian chant, although other kinds of devotional acts were also common. More benign commentators speculate that this measure was an attempt to copy the ability of medieval monasteries to maintain knowledge through ritual. Others think that the purpose was to hide the true working of technology so that even a successful spy of the great houses would not be able to gain useful information. Others just see them as the actions of a fanatical madman. It was also Karpov who replaced the practical grey jumpsuits used since the end of Star League with the bizarre white robes that should shape the look of ComStar like little elves. They were decorated with mathematical symbols, calculations, and formulas lifted right from the same readouts and science books that provided the hymns to appease the machines. To ensure the compliance and full devotion of all members, it also became mandatory to study the theological teaching of Blakeism in long, nightly teaching sessions, a subject that also included the discussions of ComStar's mission and its purpose in the inner sphere. There was opposition to these changes, of course, yet it was not enough to have any effect. Two members of the First Circuit had even resigned to protest against Karpov's policies, but he just used the opportunity to improve his possession by appointing some of his followers as replacements. More dangerous for him was his falling out with Michel Duprat. As the first head of ROM, a disciple of Blake himself, and trusted companion of Toyama, she was almost untouchable. A bad situation for the Primus, who had his own plans for ROM. According to Edict 3056, issued in 2838, the Internal Security Agency was to be enlarged and the scope of its operations widened. Instead of being a shield to protect ComStar and its members against the machinations of the houses, it was to become a sword to actively wreak havoc upon them. This was unacceptable for Duprat, who truly believed in the role of ComStar as a savior of mankind. To directly attack the successor states would dilute and alter the teachings of Blake, and turn them into an even bigger enemy of knowledge than even the houses themselves. The complete situation turned into an open confrontation in which both sides accused the other of being a heretic and traitor to the true word of Blake. At the end, Michel Duprat resigned from ROM and ComStar. She retired to Italy, where she died only 5 days later in a traffic accident. The new head of ROM was Janis Laidlaw, a staunch supporter of Karpov's policies. With his consolidated control, the Primus could start the centerpiece of his plan, Operation Holy Shroud. The horrors of the First and the ongoing Second Secession War had reduced the general level of technical knowledge in the inner sphere. It almost seemed that the word of Blake and the prophecies of Konrad Toyama about the self-inflicted destruction of the great houses would soon be fulfilled. But Raymond Karpov was a suspicious and paranoid man who would leave nothing to chance. For him, even the slight possibility of a technological recovery was a dire threat to ComStar, and proactive actions against it was a necessity. It became even more acute when the great houses started their own projects to decipher and replicate Starlink technologies, a byproduct of their need to maintain every scrap of metal and machinery they could salvage. Karpov used several examples to bring this point across. ROM had intercepted several messages that indicated that the Federated Suns were very close to replicating hyperpulse technology and to build their own HPG stations, a direct attack on ComStar's monopoly on interstellar communication. Meanwhile, the Lyran Commonwealth was making good progress in his attempts to reinvent ferrofibrous armor, a technology that went extinct 20 years ago when all production facilities were destroyed and all engineers killed. If the great houses should regain this knowledge, or any knowledge for that matter, the teachings of Jerome Blake would have been proven wrong, a mortal wound for the blessed order of ComStar. So, Karpov ordered Janis Laidlaw to use the new power of ROM against this threat. What followed was a 5-year campaign of espionage, terrorism, and mass murder, all to kill over 300 of the best scientific minds in the inner sphere. In all the successor states, scientists, engineers, researchers, and industrialists were investigated, and the most promising marked for death. The assistants of ROM took great care to not reveal their identity, or even allow suspicions about their true alliance. The murders were usually camouflaged. Especially traffic accidents were a favorite of ROM, with work mishaps and fires following his methods of choice. Sometimes it were not people but installations that were targeted, like the Hayden Medical Research Building in the Lyran world of Olympia that was burned to the ground because of a broken Bunsen burner, or Sasso's McGinney's Engineering and Science Lab, when explosion destroyed the complete facility and killed 20 scientists. While the great houses soon recognized that they had far too many coincidences, they failed to deduct the real perpetrator. Instead, they suspected each other to be responsible for the deaths and the sabotage. Operation Holy Shroud was a resounding success. Another problem was technical in nature. ComStar's effort to expand the HPG network had placed increasing strain upon the Terran and the First Circuit, and had drastically slowed transmission times. To alleviate this, Karpov decided to expand the First Circuit to 10 stations. In 2857, Arcturus, Oriente, Altair, and Capella were added, and the presenters joined as well. This expansion fixed the problem and left room for future growth, as well as allowing Karpov to further strengthen his political hold on the First Circuit. He accompanied this change with a further reform of ComStar's internal structure. Many smaller stations had started to change their management structure, usually by adding more layers of management. In some extreme cases, the acolytes were removed 5 layers away from the responsible presenter. In the doctrinal edict of 2861, Karpov clarified important things and gave them an official basis. From now on, the ranks of ComStar would be divided in 3 levels: Actualites would be the newest members in training, adepts the technicians, while the leading administrators of every world would have the rank presenter. This structure, as in use since the time of Blake, was now codified and prevented any fragmentation or bloat of the management. He also established regulations to designate a new primus. The current one would nominate a successor, who then had to be approved by the First Circuit. And finally, he introduced a rotational system. Every member of ComStar would change their position every 2 years. This made it impossible for the personnel to form lasting bonds with the locals and prevent the infiltration or corruption by agents of the great houses. The background for the last point was an incident known as the Vidar affair. Rosemary Vidar, a lying Commonwealth local agent, had successfully infiltrated ComStar. During her 3 years in the Order, she was able to pass important and classified information to her masters. It took one of Rom's intensive sweeps to discover her actions, but she was able to kill herself before she could be interrogated. Primus Karpov responded with increasing Rom's powers even further and ordering harsh surveillance of new acolytes. Everyone interested in joining ComStar was now subject to a deep investigation involving lie detectors, truth serums, and other surveillance technology of a Star League level. Potential spies were rejected or put under extensive observation. As a result of these measures, Rom was able to neutralize over 36 house agents in only the first few years. ComStar's lead in the intelligence game was getting even bigger. By 2864, the great houses had again exhausted themselves and were forced to cease their hostilities in an effort to recover their strength. Again, the danger of a technological recovery loomed over the prophecies of Jerome Blake. When the presenter Rom advised the First Circuit in 2866 that the inner sphere would likely recover all lost technology within 3 decades if the present pace continued, Karpov reacted quickly. Following Konrad Toyama's effort, he would again fan the flames of conflict. To do so, he took a very insidious path. The Draconis Combine was suffering under a so-called shadow war between the internal security forces loyal to Rovina Kurita and those supporting her brother, coordinator Yogi Kurita. Karpov authorized Rom to filter information about this conflict to the Lyran Commonwealth. When Yogi learned that the Lyrans knew of a shadow war, he reacted in typical Kurita fashion and ordered an all-out attack along the combined Commonwealth border to hide the shame of this discovery. The Third Succession War had started. He should rage until 3025. The destruction of the continued war was indeed beyond the expectations of Primus Karpov. Yet other problems should again appear. The First Circuit became more hostile to the aggressive policies and projects of the Primus and increased its effort to prevent or at least hinder their execution. Fighting this opposition was a chore that Raymond Karpov was less and less willing to fulfill. By 2875, he had enough. Citing failing health, Karpov stepped down as Primus. The designated replacement was presenter Arcturus Andrea Martin. Her nomination several years earlier had been a compromise to gain support from the opposition. Unlike him, she was a member of the liberal faction in ComStar. Raymond Karpov remained active in the Order, administrating the Blake Medical Center in Europe until his death in 2880. While arguably overshadowed by both Blake and Toyama, much of the religious tappings of the Blessed Order either came into being or were officially formalized during the reign of Raymond Karpov. Future Primus Jin Takami would later canonize him for his efforts in shaping ComStar. To guide man into the destiny foretold by Blake and his blessed saints, to protect man from themselves, to prepare a path for those to follow. In a way, we can see Blake, Toyama, and Karpov as the founders of the Blessed Order. They were the ones who created the religious organization and shaped its nature. The following succession of leaders was far more occupied to keep ComStar going than to change its direction, at least for the most part. The first primus of this middle era was Andrea Martin. Unlike Karpov, she was rather liberal in her leanings and took a less aggressive approach. Indeed, her initial relation with the First Circuit was far better and not marred with conflict and accusations. However, there was still trouble brewing, and the beginning of her tenure would be unexpectedly difficult. While the population of Terra, overwhelmingly not part of ComStar, was quite thankful for the protection and the high standard of living under its rule, the lack of political representation turned into a source for frustration and anger. Radical and extremist groups formed that demanded a return to the old system of hegemony and independence from ComStar. It was Primus Martin's misfortune that in 2875 these groups started to conduct a campaign of terrorism against the Order. Initially, she tried to weaken these radicals by depriving them of their support base. Her solution was a huge building and infrastructure plan that involved the construction of 12 arcologies on Terra, massive public work projects, a renewed effort to rebuild Venus and Mars, excavations and reconstructions in the ruins of the old capital, Unity City, and a general rising of the living standard for everyone in the Solar System. Her aim was to demonstrate for everyone that ComStar was committed to Terra and to destroy all doubts about both the intentions and capabilities of the Order. But sadly, she was only partially successful. While the radicals lost overall support, the remaining just became more aggressive. The breaking and turning point came in the summer of 2877. The presenter of New Earth, Gerald Comandi, was visiting Terra to hold a speech in London. However, he was not able to make this appointment. A simple traffic jam stopped him from leaving France. It also saved his life, because at the moment he was supposed to cross through the Eurotunnel, an explosion utterly destroyed the connection. Far more than 1,000 people, average citizens with no real connection to ComStar, were killed. And although the Order soon organized the rescue and relief efforts, there was only very little they could do. At the same time, multiple messages reached the media, identifying the perpetrators. A terror organization named Black December took full responsibility. They cited the lies and trickery of the intended target, Presenter Comandi, as motivation for the action. According to them, he was nothing but a puppet and henchman for the Primus. The result of this act of mass murder was as expected. An enraged population rallied behind ComStar and demanded the persecution and eradication of terrorists. A sentiment that was even enhanced by the shameless and massive media campaign that spread the news of the event not only all around Terra, but in the complete inner sphere and even wide parts of the periphery. When a ROM team stormed the hideout of Black December 3 months later and killed all of its members, a relieved and happy population was ready to completely back ComStar in its projects. The independence movement was no longer a thing. It should be noted that after the schism, ComStar published an alternative version. ROM conducted the attack and then used Black December as a scapegoat. It was all planned, including the traffic delay to protect the esteemed guest. Needless to say that the word of Blake rejects this and accuses itself, ComStar, of manipulating the documents and twisting the truth to serve their own agenda. Both sides could be correct. Sadly for the Primus, the situation turned even worse. The First Circuit was not happy about the economic consequences of her policies. The huge costs of their construction projects were a heavy burden on the coffers of ComStar, and to make matters worse, the economy started downturn in 2878. The opposition on the outside was gone, but the opposition inside the order against her grew with every month. Everything finally escalated in 2882, when Primus Martin made the proposal to increase the transmission rates to bolster the C-bill. The conservative elements in the First Circuit used this predicament to corner the Primus and force concessions from her. The most important, with far-reaching consequences, was the nominating of her own successor. Not surprisingly, it was one of these opponents, Dwight Croston, the presenter calf. The proposed rate increase passed within a month. The following years were uneventful until January 2901. While visiting the capital of Calf, together with presenter Kirsten, Primus Martin suffered a fatal accident. The two were riding in a hover limo when the vehicle veered from the road to avoid hitting some people crossing the road. The car rammed into a building, exploding only moments later and killing the Primus. Stunned but not hurt, presenter Krustin had managed to crawl free just prior to the explosion. Within a month, he was confirmed to be the next Primus of ComStar. However, the transition of power was not as Kirsten had hoped. Even before his promotion, the coroner's report of Primus Martin made its rounds. According to it, she was killed by a sharp blow that broke her neck, something that was not possible according to the reported events. While the result of the investigation was inconclusive at best, the new Primus believed that it was an attempt to implicate him in the death of his predecessor. Outraged, Primus Kirsten publicly denied any involvement in the accident. Then ordered that the two investigators responsible for the case were arrested, and later he had them executed by a firing squad. This is the right point to mention that Primus Kirsten was destined to become known under the telling title of Kirsten the Mad. Right from the beginning, he showed signs of extreme paranoia and bouts of violent behavior. He assumed that everyone was blaming him for Martin's end and would be conspiring to replace himself. In fact, he accused all other members of the First Circuit of involvement in the incident and had them investigated by Rom. Paranoia itself is not a major problem for Primus. It might even be a benefit to some degree, but nepotism is another matter entirely. When the first vacancy on the First Circuit had to be filled, he crossed this line. A new presenter Bernard was to be appointed, and according to procedure, the Primus would present a candidate who would then be approved by the First Circuit. Until this date, no veto had ever been used. But Kirsten had the gall to nominate his first cousin, Dana Kirsten, who had been an acolyte for a mere 10 months. Of course, the other members immediately accused the Primus of abusing his position to promote his own family and refused the affirmation. The conflict became so intense that rumors even left ComStar and reached the great houses. The behavior of the Primus and the suspicions regarding Primus Martin's death even led to a public refusal of Elizabeth Marek and Joseph Davian II to attend her funeral. An unprecedented humiliation of Kirsten, which caused another round of investigations by Rom and the executions without trial of two young adepts declared to be responsible. The situation was already bad enough, yet it should get even worse. In the first session of the First Circuit, Kirsten started to accuse one member, presenter Kohler, of plotting against him. something he of course denied, proclaiming Kohler a heretic and a traitor. The enraged Primus dismissed the First Circuit and ordered Rom to take the presenter into custody. Within 3 hours of the end of the session, all members of the First Circuit received a message from the Primus that presenter Kohler had died of natural causes while still in custody. The remaining members now fully realized that no one was off limits. The crazed Primus would not hesitate to persecute and kill all of them. Stopping him was now a question of life and death. It was the presenter of Procyon, Gregory Hartford, who organized the secret meeting of the surviving First Circuit members. They used the only place in Terra outside reach of Rom, the sealed halls belonging to the empty court of the Star League in the ruins of Unity City. Their options were limited. The regulations of ComStar made no provision for First Circuit to remove a Primus from office, and with Rom reporting directly to the Primus, there was no way to physically remove him. The best course of action was to leave Terra and isolate Primus Kirsten. But even here it was paramount to hide the full extent of the conflict so that the great houses would not exploit ComStar's weakness. They had to do something brazen and unconventional. When he learned that the First Circuit members had all left Terra, Primus Kirsten was completely outraged. On April 30th, 2901, he sent a message that was intended to reach every HPG station and every member of the Order. I, Primus of ComStar, Dwight Kirsten, call upon the support of all members of our Blessed Order. By the right of rule passed down by the Blessed Blake, I hereby dissolve the current First Circuit and name all its members as heretics. I will announce the names of their replacements in the First Circuit in the coming days. I now order the immediate apprehension of these renegade individuals. They have broken faith with their bond and oath to support both the word of Blake and ComStar. They have conspired against me personally, as well as against all true and loyal members of our order. They seek to destroy me and this office, and such disobedience cannot be tolerated. I decree that, like the heretics of old, they will be punished by burning at the stake for the heresy against the will of Blake and my command of this order. Any person who associates with or assists or aids them in any way are also traitors to ComStar and will be held for trial. May these heretics and their allies find no solace or rest. May they beware and ever watch their backs. The will of Blake shall haunt them into the darkest of nights. Later, this speech became known as the Witch Hunt Transmission. It was the final proof of a madness that had stuck the Primus. But it never made it to the intended audience. To reach the full HPG network, the transmission had to go through the First Circuit, which of course was under the control of the condemned heretics. They simply had ordered their stations to not relay any transmissions from Terra, and instead to use each other to pass messages around. The First Circuit was imposing a communications interdiction against Terra itself. And while it was a huge burden on the machines and the personnel in these installations, the provided services were good enough to prevent the rest of the Innosphere to recognize any of this. Meanwhile, the reach of the Primus was isolated to Terra, and his ability to rally possible sympathizers, or to give orders to additional ROM assets, was stifled. On Terra itself, things escalated. Unable to touch the renegades, Kirsten tried to spread his message by using jump ships as couriers, and he also started a ruthless purge of the ComStar personnel on the planet. Countless members were rounded up and killed. Finally, he decided to retreat to a more defensible position and moved with a retinue of 100 ROM bodyguards to the court of the Star League, claiming it as a new seat of power. He even went so far to unseal the throne room and to take the First Lord's throne for himself. Seeing the leader in such a mental condition prompted several of his bodyguards to attempt desertion. He had their bodies drawn and quartered as a lesson to any others who might attempt to break faith with the Primus. Recordings made via the security system still operating in the court showed how insane Dwight Kirsten had become. He had the ashes of Conrad Toyama exhumed and set them before the throne, carrying on conversations with the former Primus. He also tried to raise a new army to defend Terra and hired 3 regiments of mercenaries as first troops, offering them triple pay. Finally, loyalists in Rome managed to carry the Primus message to several worlds of the Inner Sphere, but even this organization was split. In the end, neither the Primus nor the First Circuit had enough support within Rome to give either side a decisive edge. Many agents simply laid low in the year-long crisis, trying to not take any side. Both groups were so permeated by double agents that any serious attempt at waging an intelligence war was all but impossible. Seeing that he was isolated and separated from any possible outside support, Primus Kirsten decided to take even more drastic actions. In the fall of 2901, he started Operation Winged Crusader. Old Starly equipment was given to the mercenary forces under his command. These troops would assault the First Circuit's HPGs, retake them, and give him direct control over them. If successful, this would not only crush any opposition against the Primus, but also reveal both the power and the internal problems of ComStar to the great houses. Something that must not happen. The Renegades had to use their ace in the hole. On January 3rd, 2902, an assassin shot Dwight Kirsten through the head with a laser at point-blank range, while the Primus was sitting on the massive throne of the First Lord. All security systems were shut off at the time, and the assassin escaped the scene without detection. The only tangible clue was a copy of the Word of Blake left lying on the marble floor of the throne room. Until today, the who and the how remain a mystery. The First Circuit declared the crisis to have ended and called for a summit on Terra. Here, they simply dictated their demands to a defeated loyalist. Gregory Hartford was named the next Primus. He immediately ordered an extensive cover-up of the events. The court was resealed, and Kirsten officially just resigned. The entire civil war never occurred. The new Primus stayed in office until late 2910. It should be no surprise that his reforms strengthened the First Circuit and reduced the power of the Primus by increasing his accountability. It now permitted the First Circuit to name a successor to the Primus or to remove the Primus from power on a full vote of all presenters. The measures also called for at least 3 members of the First Circuit to be informed in writing of all major ROM operations. In December of 2910, Kari Marie Marshall, presenter of Procyon, succeeded Gregory Hartford as Primus. Her biggest project was born out of an interest in the periphery. In 2920, she visited several of the states in this distant region and, by all accounts, was shocked by the poverty and desolation she encountered. To help the people, she ordered an extension of the HPG network. Well intended and a blessing for many, some planets rejected this influx of technology and activity. One of Primus Marshall journals, for example, reads, September 25th, 2920. Our delegation arrived on Dante in the Old Worlds Alliance today, and I must admit that I was stunned at the greeting committee. In other worlds of the Alliance, we have been met by dignitaries, local leaders, and afforded full diplomatic courtesies. Such was not the case today. The locals apparently have initiated a ban on technology and have reverted to a more primitive means of survival. The greeting committee consisted of several dozen local peasants who showered our dropship with spoiled fruits and egg. From my viewing port, I actually witnessed a gesture known as mooning who did nature and intend? Many of these people were obvious refugees from the Combine, who cursed us as we watched from our viewing ports. As I reread the words of a blessed Blake in the afternoon, I remembered the mockery and draw great strength from his wisdom. These are the very people that Blake sent us to serve, those who turn their backs on truth purely because of ignorance. Blake wrote of a new dark age overtaking mankind, and now, for the first time, I witnessed the embodiment of those words. I wept then in the knowledge that someday the whole sphere would fall to the same fate, and that only ComStar would survive. Such was the vision of Blake, and for the first time I have seen it myself. 2 years later, in 2922, Primus Marshal named Hollings York presenter of New Earth as successor. An uncommon choice, because he was just 22 years old. In the following years, however, he was carefully mentored by the Primus and built up to be a worthy leader himself. This included several diplomatic missions that introduced him to the other powers. After years of falling health and illness, Primus Cory Marshall died of a stroke on November 2930. As intended, the then 29-year-old Hollings York was appointed as the next Primus. He was the youngest ever to hold the office. Primus Hollings York is, without a question, the most beloved and most fondly remembered leader that the Blessed Order ever had. A young, charismatic man with a great talent as a speaker, a creative innovator who earned with his boldness and idealism the support of many and the love of the people. It was also York who founded one of the most famous and important branches of the Order. New ComStar and the Word of Blake disagree on everything, often just out of principle. But here they agree in their assessment. Both praise York as one of their greatest leaders. A perfect example for the qualities a head of ComStar should have. This all makes the tragic incident that ended his tenure in his life even more ghastly and sad. Right from the get-go, York faced a major crisis. For years, ComStar had hoped to welcome a member of House Kurita into its ranks. Since the time of Karpov, the Order had aimed to win members of all the houses as acolytes, to open new lines of communication, and especially to gain inside information about the state of the houses and its proceedings. By Hollis' time, most houses had already allowed one or even several relatives to take the robe and join up. House Kurita was a big exception. When Nises Kurita, sister to coordinator Hyugai Kurita, had asked to join ComStar, she was welcomed with open arms. Much to the chagrin of her brother, as it turned out. In multiple communiques and messages, he accused ComStar of interfering in the internal affairs of his house, which Primus York answered by accusing House Kurita of interfering in the internal affairs of ComStar. Nonetheless, the Primus ordered the presenter of Lufien, Tiffany Hendricks, to personally verify and investigate Nises Kurita's wish to join ComStar. She underwent an extensive range of ROM tests, but passed all of them. Though pleased that Nises actually wished to join ComStar, the Primus was anxious about alienating the coordinator. Despite his fears, he finally approved Nises Kurita's appointment as an acolyte. In order to escalate the matter not even further, he offered to not only restrict her positioning to Lufien, but also to keep absolute secrecy about the Kurita defection, so that the coordinator could save face. Sadly, this was to no avail. The new acolyte had just started the training in the ComStar hospice on Lufien when a strike team of ISF agents tried to extract her. However, they were identified by the 2 ROM agents that Presenter Hendricks had posted as a security detail, and in the following shootout, 4 ISF agents, both ROM agents, and a civilian died. The prodigal daughter of House Kurita was seized and returned to her family. Needless to say that she was kept under tight lockdown, guarded and surveilled by several dozen ISF agents. Primus and First Circuit now had to make a difficult choice. They could silently accept the kidnapping and imprisoning of the Sorn acolyte, or they could start an open conflict with one of the great houses. After only 15 minutes of debate, Primus York had convinced everyone to back his preferred course of action. ComStar would take a tough stand and defend itself in the open. The normal step would now have been to copy Toyama's idea and to impose an interdiction on the Combine. But here the Primus disagreed. He suspected that such measures would just lead to defiance and resistance against the wishes of ComStar, and maybe even endanger the life of Mrs. Kurita. It was the presenter Yeron, William Fullerton, who pointed to the most promising course of action. The obsessive code of honor inside the Combine would only allow the yielding under one condition: the use of military force. A complicated matter, because the Order did not field any military of its own. To change that in the shortest possible amount of time, Primus York authorized full payment plus 20% on all open mercenary contacts listed on ComStar's Mercenary Review Board. Overnight, the Order had at its command over 6 battle-hardened regiments, enough to persuade the coordinator that he might be facing an assault on a new front, while he was also at war with his neighbors. The situation improved even further for ComStar when the coordinator decided to allow one of its contracts to run out. The mercenary unit in question was an assault battalion called the Bandersnatchers. Their positioning was in striking distance of Lufien, and ComStar gladly paid them double the usual rate, gaining a unique opportunity to force the coordinator's hand. York knew that the success of this confrontation depended on his ability to allow Presenter Hendricks to call her shots locally. To do so, he used the Emergency Powers Act of the Communications Protocol of 2787, granting the presenter special command powers to operate independently of Primus or First Circuit. The presenter would use the surprise military presence arriving at Lufien as a wedge to force the coordinator to surrender Nices. Failing that, the presenter would use whatever force necessary to enforce the will of Blake and ComStar. If she met stiff resistance, ComStar was prepared to initiate its military option against the Combine. Main force of the operation would be the Bandersnatchers, which had all their markings removed and would pose as a completely new military unit under the logo of ComStar. Even the dropships were repainted to match the new identity. The commander of the operation was Presenter Hendricks, who would also use all ROM assets available. Meanwhile, the Primus himself would ready the 6 new regiments and start an approach from Terra to put additional pressure on the Combine. It would be the first military action of ComStar since Operation Silver Shield under Jerome Blake himself. Of course, the preferred outcome would have been a peaceful settlement without the use of force. Presenter Hendricks repeatedly tried to gain an audience with the coordinator, but was flat out rejected every time. It took the complete shutdown of the HPG station to force him into talks. During this meeting, the presenter requested the release of Mrs. Kurita and to respect her decision. The coordinator refused. She then used the threat of an interdiction on the full Combine to sway her opponent. He just became defiant and dared ComStar to test his resolve, just as the Primus had suspected. As a last step, she presented Hyugai Kurita with a portable holovid. In a direct call, Colonel Dietrichson, commander of the Bandersnatchers, informed the coordinator that his assault battalion was less than 10 minutes from executing a drop on his palace. Their mission was to rescue the presenter and Mrs. Kurita, and to lay waste to as much of the palace and the imperial city as possible before eviction. As an addendum, The presenter also mentioned the army coming from Terra to attack key worlds of the Combine. Without hesitation, the coordinator consented to all the terms proposed. The attack was called off, and the presenter walked away, together with the sister of the coordinator. Within the Combine, the affair was hushed up, and the average citizen never heard about it. But within ComStar, the triumph was widely publicized and celebrated. Primus York had achieved a stunning success for the Order, and its popularity even reached the same levels than that of Blake himself. Nisa Scorita and Colonel Dietrichson accompanied him on a grand tour including multiple speeches and parades. They too had gained hero status. And then the next vacancy appeared. Hendrickson was appointed presenter Dieron, making her a member of the First Circuit. As the events on Lufien had shown, military force was a mighty tool, even for a more tacit organization like ComStar. And influenced by his success, Primus York made in 2933 a daring proposal to the First Circuit: the formation of a standing military for ComStar. Called the ComStar Guards and Militia, it was planned to be a light, rapid deployment formation that could be used in situations like the affair 2 years prior. The original proposal called for the creation of 8 regiments of infantry, but because of cost reasons the number was reduced to 5 regiments. All ComStar Guards and Militia would be located in the Sol system and stay under the joint control of the Primus and the First Circuit. The core of the Guards and Militia were the former Bandersnatchers. Their contract was dissolved and they accepted to join ComStar. They would have the best equipment possible, vintage Starleague defense gear left behind after the exodus. To fund this military, York reduced the vast budget of ROM, pointing out that ROM would have less need for the money now that ComStar commanded the military force. It also had to give up their training school in the Sandhurst Royal Military College, Berkshire, England. It was to resume its old role as an HQ and training academy for the new forces. Towards the House Lords, ComStar insisted that these troops were exclusively for the defense of Terra and would not be used elsewhere. There was no protest. While extremely popular among the population of Terra and well respected in the whole inner sphere, Primus York was not without opposition inside of ComStar. It were mainly 2 groups that made things difficult for him. The first one was the First Circuit. York was always criticized for his young age and his reckless nature. But the most severe attack on him was caused by an incredible petty affair. In 2939, he was faced with accusations of having a sexual relation with Carissa Sanders. She was a rather well-known actress of not the best reputation. Their connection made the headlines for some time, and although the Primus denied any deep contact with Miss Sanders, she gave several widely published interviews where she affirmed the accusations. As a result, the presenter orienter, Adrienne Sims, started to openly oppose the Primus. She had already used the debates over funding the new military to gain concessions, and was more or less constantly feuding with York. When the news of the affair broke, the presenter claimed that his actions had soiled the Holy Office and demanded his resignation. In a move that betrayed his cunning, Primus York diffused this predicament by simply naming Adrienne Sims his successor. Now she could no longer stick to her demands without appearing power-hungry and ungrateful. The First Circuit was therefore brought in line. The second group of opposition was far more difficult to control. It was ROM, the powerful sword and shield of ComStar. York had appointed his friend, Presenter Gilbert, as head of ROM, but this was a dubious choice. Not because Gilbert was disloyal towards the Primus, far from it. The problem was his hostile attitude towards the organization he had to lead and to control. Some of First Circuit even mused that its actual purpose was to completely dismantle ROM, a claim that he himself openly denied. However, it is true that ROM received fewer and fewer resources, and it became increasingly difficult to execute their operations and conduct the required investigations. Soon this weakness became evident to the great houses, and they pounced on the opportunity to improve their own organizations and to damage the dreaded agency even more. In the Federated Suns alone, 6 ROM agents were exposed by the MIIO in the years between 2935 and 2940. Similar incidents occurred within the Free Worlds League and the Capellan Confederation. What hurt ROM the most was Primus York's refusal to answer their calls for help. In his own speeches, the Primus seemed to indicate that ROM was a slipshod organization, often reckless and acting on its own accord, using the word of Blake for justification. The same Primus who had almost pushed ComStar to the brink of war to rescue a lone acolyte was unwilling to lift a finger to help ROM agents in prisons throughout the inner sphere. Finally, in the spring of 2947, Primus York shook ComStar with his proposal to formally do away with ROM, reassigning intelligence gathering and security to the relatively new ComStar guards and militia. The announcement was made to a full gathering of all presenters on Terra. For the first time, the Primus was making his plans known to the entire Order at once. It was obvious to everyone present that ROM no longer enjoyed support within the leadership of ComStar. Just 2 months later, Primus York visited Sandhurst Royal Military College to participate in its cornerstone laying ceremony. Accompanied by more than half the First Circuit, he held a speech before a crowd composed of ComStar adepts and civilian construction workers. That is, until a series of laser blasts silenced him. The Primus was hit 3 times, the Presenter ROM and Presenter of the Sea were also wounded. York hung onto life for an hour, but even ComStar's advanced medical technology could not save him. An adept named Dutch Courier was identified as the assassin. He was a volunteer for the ComStar Guards and had the task to guard the perimeter. He became suspicious because he had escaped from the scene after the shots. He was later tracked down, but decided to resist arrest. Mortally wounded, he insisted on his own innocence and claimed to know the names of the real perpetrators, yet he did not name them. The question about the investigation, the murder, and the surrounding mystery is still one of the greatest questions in ComStar's history. Sadly, there is an abundance of possible suspects. Was Adrian Sims tired of waiting and decided to hurry the line of succession? Did ROM take revenge? Were the payments Dutch Courier received from the Dacorn's Combine real or misdirection? Was the Primus slain by a bizarre cabal inside ComStar, as the Combine would subtly claim 130 years later? Or was Dutch Courier a lone gunman who took his shot at immortality? Who knows? 8 days after the death of Primus York, the new Primus, Adrian Sims, announced that instead of dismantling ROM, she would restore funding to the organization and enlarge its scope. Adrian Sims had been affirmed as Primus just 6 hours after Primus York's death. While she had been a fierce adversary of him in the First Circuit and later a distant successor, her behavior after the incident was decent, respectful, and full of reverence. Her first act was to proclaim 7 days of mourning. The funeral of York was a somber but also huge event. As the first Primus to gain a substantial popularity outside of the Order, York had been an icon and hero for many people in the whole sphere. It was a proof of his influence that, indeed, all 5 leaders of the warring great houses attended the funeral. And while they tried to best avoid each other, they all met with a new Primus and the First Circuit. We should also keep in mind that this was the middle of the Third Succession War. After 80 years of constant attacks, counterattacks, skirmishes, and endless sieges, everyone had lost hope of a swift victory or even the chance of a lasting truce. When Sims now presented herself as a peacemaker and negotiator, the reactions of the great houses were benevolent but muted. In a rather cunning move, she even pressed to canonize Hollings York as a ComStar saint. It was evident that she would never be able to outshine him, and replace the glorious image that the inner sphere had of him. But by going above and beyond her duty as successor, she was able to co-opt some of his popularity for herself. By capitalizing on his fame and reputation, it was possible to improve the public opinion of ComStar even after his murder. As already mentioned in the preceding chapter, she was anything but the enemy of Rom. In fact, she viewed the powerful agency as the core and essence of ComStar. And to ensure that not only its loyalty was maintained, but also its status and influence as well, she dismissed the injured presenter Rom Gilbert. His plans of dismantling Rom had even less of a future than he himself. Instead, she named her own brother, Carl Sims, the new presenter Rom. He was tasked with rebuilding the agency to protect the sanctity of ComStar. Something made easier by the enormous increase in Rom's budget that the First Circuit approved. This effort was, besides the continuous glorification of Primus York, the only real project in the first few years of her tenure. 2959, this would change in a way fitting an organization that called itself the Blessed Order. In this year, Primus Adrian Sims started to suffer from repeating nightmares. The events and actors shown in them were unsettling and horrifying. It became so bad that the Primus deemed it necessary to inform the First Circuit about them. We have an account of one of her first dreams. One night, she had fallen asleep at her desk and was awakened by the ghostly figure of Jerome Blake. The apparition stood next to a map of the inner sphere and pointed to the mysterious space beyond the territories of the current governments. In a chilling voice, he warned her that the only true threat to ComStar lay far beyond the borders of the inner sphere. Of course, the first idea was to take a vacation and professional help to recuperate, but the dreams continued to come. Unsure what to do next, the Primus decided to again inform the First Circuit about them. This time, the nightmare was slightly different. This time it was Konrad Toyama, who appeared to her in a dream, also pointing to a map of the inner sphere. Suddenly, the borders seemed to burst into flames, and strange monsters and beings leapt out from the flames until the whole map of the inner sphere had been turned to mere ashes. The Primus insisted that the visions were prophecies of the future. Soon, opponents of the Primus tried to use these visions to raise questions about her sanity and damage her position inside of ComStar. A foolish idea that betrayed that they did not understood the true nature of their own organization. Inside the Blessed Order, many sided with the Primus and agreed that her dreams were truly a warning from Blake himself. A mystic revelation that not only informed them about the terrible peril they may face in the future, but also it renewed and changed the purpose of ComStar. Primus Sims turned from a mere replacement of Primus York to a holy woman and prophet of her own right. Her power inside the Order was now unquestioned. Motivated by her visions, she decided that it was wrong to face the terror from beyond ignorant, but that ComStar had to gain knowledge about it as soon as possible. For this task, she created a new branch, the Explorer Corps. Their mission would be to travel the unexplored systems of a galaxy, in the deep periphery and far beyond via jump ship. On the way, they would create reports and detailed map about every discovery they made: planets, asteroids, abandoned installation, and most important, signs of human settlements. It should be a peaceful mission. Neither the jump and dropships nor the personnel were heavily armed. If contact was made, they were to engage in diplomacy and negotiations. The gained information would be shared with the sphere, after securing any relevant technology, of course. A special part of this campaign was the mystery of a long-departed Kerensky Exodus fleet. Primus Sims knew that her visions alone would not be enough to convince the hardened politicians on the First Circuit to approve and bankroll such a huge and far-reaching endeavor. Using Kerensky and his war potential as a possible source of trouble, a non-spiritual argument could be made for it. No one could fathom how correct this worry would be. By 2961, the first ships of the Explorer Corps began to make their way through the vast periphery. Though they did not find the trail of a Kerensky fleet, they did locate a number of isolated and forgotten colonies. Some of the colonists had never learned of the fall of Starleague. Others had been formed by civilians fleeing the horrors of the First Succession War. Sometimes the explorers had disastrous contact with pirates, new diseases, or deadly plants and animals, but such risks seemed to make the Explorer Corps all the more romantic for recruiting purposes. Its work also helped to improve the Order's relation with the House leaders when ComStar informed the periphery and House governments of the discovery of some of these lost settlements. The truly frightening thing about Primus Sim's nightmares is that they contain descriptions of characters that were close resemblance of the totem animals used by the clans. The metallic viper of Clan Steel Viper, or the emerald birds of death of Clan Jade Falcon, just to name two. And it should be the actions of the Explorer Corps that made the offsprings of Kerensky's exodus aware of the Ionosphere again. But that was long after the time of Primus Sims. In 2979, she died in her sleep, of natural causes. She had never named a successor, leaving the task to the First Circuit. To honor a drive into the unknown, her ashes were scattered in deep space by one of her Explorer jump ships. The next and 10th Primus was Yin Takami, presenter of New Earth. His time at the head of ComStar should right from the beginning start with one of the most bizarre threats that the Blessed Order faced, the Tripits affair. Just 10 days after his approval, Primus Takami was informed by presenter Rom, Carl Sims, that forces of a Taurian Concordat had discovered a long-abandoned Black Lion-class battlecruiser, the Tripits, in an empty star system near New Vandenberg. While an ancient relic from the time of the Starleague, the Concordat seemed confident and eager to repair and recommission the old warship. 200 years prior, this would not have made a big difference, but the situation had changed drastically. One of the most serious results of the succession wars had been the loss of almost all existing warships. So the discovery of even a single one was enough to completely change the balance and power dynamic in the sphere. Not only because it could be an asset for the Taurians, but also because it could fall into the hands of far more powerful entities with far bigger industrial capacity, like the Capellan Confederation, which was planning their own reclamation mission. Primus Takami was not willing to take chances. He ordered the 1st Division of the ComStar Guards and Militia to rush into the system and completely destroy the Tripits, denying the prize to all others. The strike force had all its markings removed and the vessels painted completely white. They were under strict orders to avoid any kind of communication during the operation. They just entered the system and immediately attacked the Taurian units protecting the battlecruiser. The resistance was stiff and forceful, but no match against the superior technology of the attacking fighters. In less than an hour, the battle was over. What followed was the swift and utterly destruction of the old warship, before the white force retreated and disappeared without a trace. The Tripits should soon turn into one of the great mysteries, and it took a schism, a reformation, and an opened archive for the truth to come out. The danger of losing the technology advantage against the houses was one of the driving forces for Primus Takami. The successor states were not staying idle and had continued to regain some of the lost tech that their ancestors used in the past. For him, an admirer of the third Primus, Raymond Karpov, the solution was clear. Operation Holy Shroud had to be renewed and the progress of the house destroyed. A campaign of assassination and terrorism to kill scientists and engineers and to demolish laboratories and research installations. But the times were different now. The great houses had far better intelligence agencies and were able to prevent a multitude of plots to play out. Many targets were saved and could continue their research. It was lucky for ComStar that still no one was able to identify them as a real culprit, and they could carry out some of the missions. But overall, the results were mixed and mediocre, a far cry from the resounding success the original Operation Holy Shroud had been. But the most important change to ComStar under the rule of Jin Takami was the extension of the First Circuit. Since the time of Blake, the First Circuit were always presenters of the most important HPG relay station. It was a position based on the technical proceedings of interstellar communication, not the wider politics outside of ComStar. Takami wanted to change this by fully embracing the political nature of the First Circuit. He proposed to name 4 new members and to change the position of one already existing. One for each of the great houses. These new presenters would represent all HPG stations in the corresponding state, inform the Primus about the politics, and serve as a direct connection to the houses. This was Primus Jin Takami's speech he held to the First Circuit on June 14, 2988. The motion I place before you, esteemed members of the First Circuit, is to realign ourselves, that we may better fulfill the will of Blessed Blake. The First Circuit faces a great threat, not from the weak House Lords, but rather from within. We have deluded ourselves into believing that all we need to do is sit back and wait, and the will of Blake will unfold. That simply is not the case. Our participation in the affairs of the inner sphere is required if our order is to succeed in its holy crusade. But, as it stands now, the First Circuit lacks inspiration and drive. I seek to change that. I propose that we add several new members to our ranks. The new positions I seek are Presenter Tarkat for the Commonwealth, Presenter Xian for the Capellan Confederation, Presenter Atreus for the Free Worlds League, and Presenter New Avalan as the Advocate member of the Circuit for the Federated Suns. I propose also making Presenter Dieron the Advocate of the Draconis Combat. The role of the Advocate member is to speak as counsel to the First Circuit for each of the realms he or she represents. Thus will this esteemed council act in accordance with the will of Jerome Blake, by fully understanding the impact of our decisions on the various houses of the inner sphere. So it has been proposed, now I challenge you, the members of the circuit, to take the risk and make a stand on the issue. The future of our order is all that is at stake. It goes without saying that the Primus had to use any political maneuver at his disposal to convince the First Circuit into accepting this plan. The result was a change in the leadership of ComStar, which would determine its course of action for the rest of its existence. The Advocate seats proved to be a double-edged sword. In Primus Takami's time, they were useful in providing ComStar with the insights into the thinking of the various house governments. Over time, these Advocate presenters created a majority power base for themselves through the ties to the ruling houses of each successor state. As the presenters not associated with the house found themselves gradually losing their voice in the direction of ComStar, they eventually stopped attending First Circuit meetings, leaving only the core of house-aligned presenters in power. Officially, all presenters administrating the First Circuit HPGs are still members of the First Circuit. In our own day, These advocacy seats played a role in the betrayal of our order. The death of Yin Takami was one of the most spectacular ones in the history of ComStar. In late 2994, the Pride of Blake, the Primus private jump ship, experienced a full engine core overload and meltdown. At that time, the Primus and 2 members of the First Circuit were on board. All 3 perished in the following explosion of the ship. Just as his predecessor, he had failed to name a successor, so the First Circuit decided to give the leadership to the presenter Alpha C, Al Rosenstein. Looking back, the tenure of Yin Takami represents a decisive change in the behavior and the policy of ComStar. Especially the reform of the First Circuit opened the order to a strong involvement in the affairs of the great houses, and the aggressive actions during the Tripitz affair and Operation Holy Shroud II prepared the way for a far more active ComStar. So, just like Raymond Karpov, who was declared a saint by Takami, marks the end of early ComStar, the Primus Yin Takami marks the end of the Middle Era. Those who had to follow him would belong to the late phase of ComStar's history. It must not be forgotten that Primus Rosenstein's appointment to the First Circuit were the foundation of today's ComStar and Word of Blake. Not only did he name former Primus Sims as the saint of the order, but some of his other appointments, Christopher, Tiepolo, Vandel, would all play key roles in the direction of both our orders. Presenter Alpha C, Alan Rosenstein, was a man who had reached his position by displaying incredible skill as an administrator, while displaying little to no political will or agenda. Primus Alan Rosenstein was the exact opposite. What was thought to be a safe choice that would not harass the members of the First Circuit and give ComStar a break from the aggressive actions of his predecessor turned out to be a political savvy fanatic who would push the order further down the road of conflict. His first action as Primus was to name replacements for the 2 First Circuit presenters that had perished alongside Primus Takami. To the surprise to everyone else, he nominated 2 extremist hardliners, religious fanatics that had no substantial power base in the order itself and represented a loud but very small minority. The new position changed the power dynamics in the First Circuit massively. To support this shift in direction on an ideological basis, Rosenstein published his own manifest, Blessed Destiny. Using quotes of the founders of ComStar, Blake, Toyama, and Karpov, he presented ComStar with a new blueprint to fulfill its destiny. Core component was it to manipulate the great houses into fighting each other and to improve ComStar's power by using them as unwitting pawns in the great game. The key to do so was the order's advantage in information and technology, something that had to be improved and protected at all cost. But in other passages of the book, he evolved the approach and mused that the direct use of military force could be a future option for ComStar, a type of operation that was first attempted by the beloved Primus York, as Rosenstein gleefully pointed out. At the end, Blessed Destiny was to become one of the most influential books inside of ComStar. Another topic that was important was the role of the periphery. Primus Rosenstein had a passion for the study of history. A special favorite of him was Primus Marshall and her attention toward the periphery. The knowledge of her experience there should serve him well. In the year 3000, the recruitment potential of ComStar was drying up. The population of Terra was already completely covered by the efforts of ComStar, and the rest of the inner sphere was suffering from massive attrition and fragmentation, not to speak of a growing distrust against ComStar. Rosenstein solved this problem by following Primus Marshall's lead. A mass recruitment campaign in the poor and disenfranchised worlds of the periphery was started. But the overall behavior and policy of the Primus was twisted and full of malintent. He used the media to propagandize the investments and benefits that ComStar was giving to the periphery to improve a reputation among the hopeful acolytes to be. Yet, at the same time, he was lobbying hard in the First Circuit to actually curtail and reduce these very expenses. He himself hated the periphery and viewed it as a source for problems. He also feared that it would become a terrible danger for the complete inner sphere if full communications were to be restored. The news featured the benefits of trade initiated by ComStar, but the truth was that ComStar had removed resources from all construction projects and put a permanent freeze on all HPG extensions. The worlds at the fringe of humanity remained utterly dependent on jump ships to communicate with each other, and both ships were overwhelmingly controlled by ComStar. In this way, it was impossible for periphery to improve their situation. But at the same time, the recruitment campaign was a resounding success. Countless applicants from periphery came to join ComStar. Over time, they should start to outnumber the sphere-born members of the Order. The organization was destined to be made up by people who were brought up in the borders of mankind, who had no connection, and in most cases, not even sympathy for the inner sphere and the successor states. People for whom the Order was the only purpose and single loyalty. Another, far smaller event was the introduction of a new acolyte into the Order. Thomas Marek, son of Captain General Janos Marek, asked to join the Order. It was cause for celebrations because he was the heir of a Captain General over the FWL, which made him the highest-ranking House member to ever swear fealty to the Blessed Order and to follow the word of Blake. The true extent of this decision and the role he should play are an important part of history that shall be presented at another time. Rosenstein's beginning as Primus were strong, but degraded over time. The very same presenters he had appointed started to question his competence, and the others were rather unwilling to support him. On several occasions, his proposals for funding to enlarge the ComStar Guards and Militia were voted down unanimously by the rebellious First Circuit. In the future, things should get far worse. In 3001, the Third Succession War had turned into a tedious dragging on. One region where this was clearly visible was the border between the Lyrans and Drax. Officially, the Steiner forces were on an offensive, but the troops were so exhausted that even the ruthless social generals of this house preferred to let them slow down. They used the delays in communication and overstated problems with logistics to give their men some rest. On the other side was the extremely centralized combine of Hohiro Kurita, unable to make any quick moves, decisive reactions, or even counteroffensives. Officers as well as rank and file also suffered under an ever-increasing atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia, paralyzing them. And every additional resource was used to reinforce the fighting against the Federated Suns. Primus and First Circuit were rather displeased with such development. They wanted to increase the overall hostility between the war realms and rekindle the fighting. So a plan was hatched to use a threat from the periphery to provoke a deeper involvement of both houses. Primus Rosenstein only approved it half-heartedly, but it should forever be associated with his legacy. Rom would commence with a Jolly Roger plan. It meant that ComStar would supply several pirates operating in the periphery with military hardware and supplies. With these enhanced capabilities, The new petty kings and warlords could operate inside Lyran and Draconis space, striking and looting targets that were far more interesting than the usual victims in the periphery. By the spring of 3002, several of these newly formed bandit kings struck along the periphery borders of the Lyran Commonwealth. Within half a year, the same pirates attacked the Draconis Combine. Both sides blamed the other for sponsoring the bandit raids, and as a result, escalated their conflict. It really seemed like a resounding success for the strategies outlined in Blessed Destiny. The fighting between the houses increased rapidly. Both moved troops from the former hegemony worlds, close to Terra, away into the periphery, giving the people there some respite from the constant war. And no one blamed ComStar for anything. It was a masterwork of manipulation, and Primus Rosenstein was more than happy to take full credit for this operation. In 3004, things started to get nasty. Two bandit kings, Blackjack McGurk and Darlene Dunson, united their forces. Each only fielded about a battalion of troops. However, combined they had almost a regiment of battle mags and support forces. As the top dog, they also attract other smaller groups and crew, who further bolstered their numbers. A force that allowed them to reach deep into the Commonwealth and to decisively overstep the perimeters of Jolly Roger. The Primus dispatched Presenter Quintero of the ComStar Guards militia to put them back into line. But here things escalated even more. At the end of the negotiations, a sizable number of ComStar guards and pirates, including Darlene Dunson, were all dead. Her partner, ally, and lover, Blackjack McGurk, retaliated by attacking and destroying the HPG stations on the planets Lost and Canal, killing the ComStar personnel in the process. Jolly Roger had gone bad. To save the situation, the Primus ordered the 1st Division of the ComStar Guard and Militia to wipe out the renegade pirates. The battle lasted for almost 3 days on the isolated, unmapped world of Trisha. 8 jumps at the periphery. In the end, Blackjack McGurk's combat experience allowed him and his men to demand a hefty price. His own forces were virtually wiped out, but they achieved a 2.3 to 1 kill ratio against the Green Com Guards. The blame for this debacle was laid on the man who had willingly taken the credit for it, Primus Rosenstein. To make matters worse, a new force suddenly appeared in the sphere, baffling even the almighty ComStar and the omniscient Grom. In 3005, a group calling themselves Wolves Dragoons appeared in the Federated Stanza. The First Circuit demanded of Col Sims, the aging presenter Rom, to explain the origin of the 5 fully armed and equipped battle mech regiments. When Sims' operatives were unable to penetrate Dragoon security and 2 agents died in the attempt, he was relieved of his post. Vizar Christopher was his replacement. The most concerning thing were the new battle mechs and ships in pristine condition used by the Dragoons. And to make it even worse, none of them matched the worn and jury-rigged types common in the sphere. Some followed superior Star League patterns, while others were even of completely unknown new designs. A display of technology and innovation that unsettled ComStar. When even the economy crumbled and the Sibyl entered freefall, the First Circuit lost all faith in the Primus. In spring 3006, the First Circuit requested the resignation of Primus Rosenstein, citing his failing in both the Dragoon and Jolly Roger affair as sufficient reason. Alan Rosenstein resigned as Primus a week later, allowing the First Circuit to select his replacement. For the next 10 years, he would spend as presenter of a St. Ives HPG station, before passing away as a broken and lonely man. The First Circuit selected Julian Tiepolo, the middle-aged presenter Atreus, to become the new Primus. Tiepolo was a calm and reserved individual who, like his predecessors, possessed strong organizational and administrative skills. His appointment was a result of a settlement between the conservative and liberal factions within the First Circuit. When he became the new leader of the Order, he faced two significant issues. One was the ongoing attempts of Rom to infiltrate Wolf's Dragoons and to uncover their origins. The other, which was more pressing, was the ongoing devaluation of the sea bill compared to the house currencies, particularly those of House Merrick. To address the situation, Prime Minister Apollo introduced some fiscal reforms that included a 20% rate increase. However, these measures were only a temporary solution. It is noteworthy that the previous leader, Prime Minister Rosenstein, had attempted to pass a similar bill, but due to his worsening relationship with the First Circuit, it was not approved. In 3009, the Dragoons disappeared, and upon their return, they had new members and resources. The following year, presenter Rom, Christopher, proposed a plan for a civil war within the Free Worlds League. Duke Anton Merrick, brother of Captain General Janos Merrick, would launch a rebellion against his brother for the control of the FWL. This rebellion would require support from Maximilian Liao, who would send troops to aid Anton Merrick. Prior to Anton Merrick's announcement of his rebellion, negotiations had already taken place between him and Maximilian. This included an arrangement for Liao's daughter, Candace, to marry Anton Merrick in the future. Additionally, the Capel Confederation agreed to provide military training and intelligence to support Merrick's cause. Liao intended to use this support to gain influence on the FWL and to later rule it through his daughter. The objective of the entire plan was straightforward: to cause a full-scale civil war and weaken House Merrick's economy. The calculated losses would also force the Dragoons to make another supply run, which would be traced by ComStar's force to uncover the source of the equipment. Furthermore, if Anton's rebellion succeeded, ComStar would gain a strong position within the Free Worlds League for further expansion. However, it was not without danger. If ComStar was ever linked to instigating a civil war, all the great houses would launch intelligence operations against Rom. They might even attempt to take over ComStar's communications network. Additionally, if the plan failed to weaken Wolf's Dragoons, they might view ComStar as a potential threat, which could put Terra itself in danger. It is unclear if a plan was created or just supported by the Primus. But in 3014, ComStar started to encourage Anton Merrick's ambitions to rule. Presenter Rom, Christopher, served as a personal liaison between Anton Merrick and Maximilian Liao in a meeting at Kishmir Ecology on Terra. He carefully managed the negotiations to include military support from Wolf's Dragoons. Merrick returned to the Free Worlds League with Jamie Wolf, and presenter Christopher had all his paces in play of a grand game he aimed to play. Later that year, Anton Merrick announced himself as the true Captain General of the Free Worlds League and launched a full-scale rebellion against his brother. In 3015, presenter Rom, Christopher, persuaded Anton Merrick to divide the Wolf's Dragoons into several units and place them under the control of his own officers. This action violated the original contract and resulted in aggressive altercation between Anton Merrick and Jamie Wolf. Christopher used this to put more stress on the Dragoons. He manipulated Anton's emotions by fueling his anger towards the wolves' disobedience and encouraged him to take the Dragoons' families hostage once Jamie Wolf and most of his troops had left New Dallas, as a means to secure the wolves' cooperation. Duke Anton Merrick then captured Joshua Wolf, all the Dragoon staff and their families stationed on New Dallas. He sent a message to Jamie Wolf with an ultimatum: either place his troops under the command of Merrick's officers, or their hostages would be killed. However, immediately after the hostages were taken, they were executed, and the reason behind this is still unknown. Both Anton Merrick and Presenter Rom Christopher did not anticipate the hunger for revenge the Dragoons would feel after this betrayal. They turned around and launched an attack on Anton Merrick's palace on New Dallas. While Duke Merrick died in the attack, Presenter Christopher managed to escape. Upon his return to Terra, Primus Apollo placed him under house arrest. The First Circuit could not forgive Rom's failure to learn the Dragoons' source of supply. But the plan was not a complete failure. The value of Merrick's house currency plummeted as a result of the Civil War, improving ComStar's financial situation in the process. The Dragoons decided to delay the next supply run until 3019. However, ComStar still could not figure out where the Dragoons were getting their supplies from or to follow their trail. In 3015, Hans Davian, who had recently become the Prince of the Federated Suns, announced plans to build the new Avalon Institute of Science, NAIS. The university was designed specifically to recover the lost technology of the Star League. Soon after, Hal Steiner and Kurita also established their own research facilities, but the NAIS was considered superior to the others. From 3016 to 3025, Rom made several attempts to infiltrate it, but all of them failed. The Primus himself was convinced that the will of Blake would ultimately triumph. If they could escalate the war, he believed that House Davian would be forced to redirect funding towards war preparations, which would ultimately lead to the failure of the NAIS. ComStar had always viewed alliances between the great houses as against the will of Blake. But Primus Apollo began to think of a way how to use such alliances for the benefit of ComStar. Maybe it would become possible to pit these coalitions against each other. An opportunity to test these assumptions appeared in 3020. ComStar transmitted a message from Katrina Steiner calling for peace among the great houses of the Inner Sphere. Only Hans Davian of the Federated Suns responded, and Primus Apollo saw an opportunity to use it as his advantage. Not only did he accept the peace offer, Prince Davian even proposed an alliance between the Federated Suns and the Lion Commonwealth to create one great realm, the Federated Commonwealth. And to cement the alliance, he suggested marrying Melissa Steiner, the Archon's daughter. While Primus Apollo was thrilled with this development, the First Circuit was shocked by the idea of having to handle such a powerful alliance. The Primus waved off their arguments only a week before the treaty signing ceremony. He summed up his reasoning. We have a choice: let the unification take place without our involvement, or act as a guiding force behind it. I choose the second option because it gives ComStar means of control, and the blessed Blake himself realized the value of such control. To address their concerns, the Apollo allowed Rom to leak information of the alliance treaty to the intelligence agencies of the other houses. The resulting rumors would lead to the formation of a counter-alliance among the remaining house leaders to defend themselves against the new Federated Commonwealth. In 3022, Subhash Indraha, head of the Draconis Combine's ISF, invited General Merrick to discuss a mutual defense treaty. When Merrick arrived at the Terran Alps retreat of Elmau, he discovered that Takeshi Kurita had also invited Maximilian Liao. Janus was angry with Kurita for attempting to ally him with House Liao, who had just helped Merrick's brother to launch a civil war against him. But eventually, Kurita convinced Merrick that the future threat of a federated Commonwealth was more important than justice for past transgressions. The resulting treaty, called the Concord of Carpathian, called for an end to all hostilities between the houses Kurita, Marek, and Liao, and for mutual support in training and intelligence. Prime Minister Polo was pleased with the results, having turned the inner sphere into 2 armed camps. Satisfied for the moment that both unified factions were already planning to continue the hostilities against their enemies. Sometime later, ComStar's agent learned that the Grey Death Legion's landhold on Helm was located above a cache of Star League equipment, materiel, and possibly a Star League library. Such a dangerous storage of technology and knowledge could not be allowed to exist outside the Order. Action was required. ComStar informed House Merrick of a suspected stockpile and secured their cooperation to recover it. However, they believed that the Great Death Legion would not allow access to the landhold, and feared they could discover the cache and make use of its findings. To address this, ComStar planned to frame the Great Death Legion for a minor civilian incident that would result in their destruction, allowing ComStar to infiltrate the Free Worlds League forces and then to locate and recover or destroy the stockpile. Presenter Emilio Rajan was put in charge of a division of ComStar guards and militia on standby to execute the plan. However, he escalated the situation by attempting to start another civil war and to destabilize the region even further by contracting rebels inside the Free Worlds League. He also orchestrated the massacre of more than 12 million inhabitants of Series 5, using Grey Death Legion's colors and markings on battle mechs and ships. He did this by destroying the domes, ancient wonders of technology dating back to the Golden Age of Star League. They protected the civilians of Series 5 from the deadly atmosphere of their world. A word of the massacre did not reach Prime Minister Apollo until Rahan's plan was well underway. When the First Circuit learned of Presenter Rahan's betrayal, the scale of murder, and the loss of irreplaceable technology, they ordered him excommunicated from ComStar and exterminated by Rom. But Rom should never carry out their order. Colonel Grayson Carlyle of the Grey Death Legion not only was able to defeat the FWL forces in all engagements, he also discovered the true value of the Star League Library Core and managed to slay the renegade presenter Rahan. To make things truly devastating, the Grey Death Legion made multiple copies of the memory core and sent them to almost all parties in the inner sphere. Rom was able to intercept and destroy multiple of them, but plenty made it through. Most damning one copy that reached the NAIS and the Federated Suns. The bungled affair with the Grey Death Legion and the Star League Library Core were more blemishes on the record of Primus Julian Tiapolo. Combined with his failure regarding the Dragoons, these scandals would have destroyed his career, were it not for the outbreak of the Fourth Succession War. The start of the Fourth Succession War was announced in the midst of a wedding reception for Hans Davian and Melissa Steiner in August 3028. ComStar hosted the ceremony. Besides that, two further events occurred that undermined the trust in the capabilities of Rom. First, Colonel Jamie Wolfe arrived at reception, bearing the sword of the late Minobu Tetsuhara, which he delivered to Takashi Kurita, along with a dressing down for the waist of a valuable soldier. An affront against Rom, because all kinds of weapons had strictly been forbidden during the celebration. Wolfe's ability to smuggle a sword past the security was anything but a small incident. Second, the House Liao entourage was involved in assassination attempt against Quintus Allard, the head of House Davian's MIIO. 2 Rom security details were killed during the incident. The perpetrators remained unknown. The declaration of war itself is widely known history. Raising his glass in a toast before all the leaders of the inner sphere at his wedding reception, Hans Davian declared war on House Liao and announced that his forces were already striking at the heart of the Confederation. The Lyrian Commonwealth had also opened up a full-scale invasion of the Draconis Combine. The Fourth Succession War had begun, catching ComStar completely unprepared. The 2-year-long war was quite short but extremely bloody. The centuries-lasting Third Succession War had not resulted in meaningful changes of the border and never endangered the established social and political order. The repercussions of the Fourth should shape the sphere for the rest of the 31st and even much of the 32nd century. In November 3028, the First Circuit of ComStar held a meeting to discuss the possibility of one side achieving total victory in an ongoing war. To prevent such an outcome, Presenter Waterley proposed that ComStar should impose a full communications interdiction on the Federated Suns. In May of the following year, House Davian forces attacked Sarna. To provide a pretext for an interdiction against the Federated Suns, Rom developed a plan to frame House Davian and Federated Suns for an attack on the HPG station of that world. To create proof, a small group of ComStar guards and militia was disguised as the 5th Certus Fusiliers and transported to the surface of Sarna. Using captured inventory sheets, their mechs were painted to look exactly like those of the Fusiliers. The troops were told that the personnel of the HPG station had mutinied against ComStar and were aiding House Davian. The ComStar guards were then sent to attack the HPG while being filmed by a Rom operative. This allowed ComStar to gather evidence against House Davian and the Federated Suns, which was immediately placed under interdiction starting June 1st, 3029. The ComStar guards were smuggled off-world, and House Davian was left trying to piece together what had happened. To avert their investigation, Rom operatives planted evidence implicating House Dios Maskurovka in the attack. However, there is another version of this incident. Some suggest that the entire battle was staged on Terra and that no real attack actually occurred. The likelihood of this version of event is a matter of personal judgment. The primary opponent of Primus Tiapolo was not a House Lord, a secret agent, or Jamie Wolfe, or the Great Death Legion. Rather, it was an individual in ComStar with great ambition, unyielding determination, and savage ruthlessness, who coveted the position of Primus for herself. Presenter Dieron Yundo Waterley. Despite the interdiction of the Federated Suns, slowing the Davian war machine, it failed to hold its advance entirely. With Tikhonov firmly under control of the Federated Suns, House Liao faced near annihilation. In August of 3029, Presenter Waterley brought forth shocking evidence to the First Circuit. A copy of a Star League memory core recovered by the Great Death Legion had made its way to the NAIS. Should this information fall into the hands of the great minds gathered there, ComStar would face an unparalleled threat to its technology superiority. Waterley used this revelation to call for an expulsion of Primus Apollo, who suffered a heart attack amidst the ensuing debate and was rushed to the Hilton Head Medical Center. 2 days later, he suffered an additional massive stroke and was kept on life support after that. In the midst of this crisis, the First Circuit agreed to Waterley's proposal to attack the NAIS and destroy or capture the memory core. Together with the Presenter ROM, a battalion-sized strike force was assembled, made to resemble an elite force of the House Liao Death Commandos. All troops volunteered, fully aware that the mission was a one-way attack and under no circumstances were to be taken prisoner. The mech warriors were given a quick-acting poison with the Presenter ROM to use if they were captured. Success was the only acceptable outcome. On September 10th, 3029, the ComStar Death Commandos attacked the New Avalon Institute of Science. Prince Davian himself led the counterattack in his Battlemaster, with NIAS security supporting him. The battle on the campus lasted over 2 full hours, and when it was over, the ComStar force had been destroyed to the last battle mech. The memory core remained intact and in the hands of the Federated Suns scientists. The clandestine mission was a dismal failure. Despite this setback, the First Circuit did not blame Presenter Waterley. Primus the Apollo had failed for so long to take any action against the Federated Commonwealth that Waterley's bold move was thus excusable. No one on the First Circuit doubted her personal power or devotion to the word of Blake, and her star was on the rise. In November, Primus the Apollo passed away in his hospital bed. The First Circuit appointed Mjolnir Waterley as the 13th Primus of the Blessed Order. On the 1st of January, 3001, a family of lowly plantation workers on the combine world of Kazoo was blessed with the birth of a daughter. As a gifted student, she soon caught the attention of the Internal Security Force and the Order of Five Pillars. And with such support, it was made possible for her to enroll at the University of Yeron. The petite, slender, and myopic woman was destined to become a member of the Combine's security apparatus. Yet this never came to be. Shocked by the killing of a fellow student and the intense questioning she endured at the hands of the ISF, she instead went to the local HPG station and joined ComStar. She would not be a simple part of a Combine. Mjolnir Waterley was on her way to become one of the most important figures of the 31st century. Her ascent to power was a tumultuous and controversial period in the history of ComStar. Within 10 years, during the end of the Third Succession War, Waterley climbed the ranks from Adept on Dieron to Advocate Presenter of the First Circuit, and then Primus. Before that, she had already faced charges of treason, the danger of excommunication, and she had also led the call to interdict House Davian and marshaled the use of ComStar troops in an attack on the capital world of one of the great houses. Quite an achievement for someone who was not yet Primus. Altogether, Waterley was an advocate for the most aggressive elements of ComStar, promoting the use of force to fulfill the prophecies of Blake. Historians agree that the First Circuit supported her appointment to the primacy because most of its members feared standing against her after witnessing the fall of Julian the Apollo. This shift in approach to dealing with the inner sphere was neither wrong nor inherently evil. Primus Waterley saw the gradual downslide of ComStar under Primus the Apollo. Waterley believed that the ComStar Guards and Militia, renamed the Com Guards under her leadership, would save the word of Blake. In accordance with her offensive approach, she quickly replaced Presenter Rom Jalath with a ultra-radical Nicholas Cassou, only 3 days into her primacy. In November 3029, as the Fourth Secession War drew to a close, Waterly initiated discussions with the Federated Sons concerning the interdiction. Using the ComStar attack on Sarna as an example of a need for better protection for ComStar's HPGs, she convinced Hansa Davian that his forces were inadequate and suggested placing ComStar troops and battlemechs within the ComStar compounds on each world in his empire. Despite his reluctance, Prince Davian agreed, and by December the interdiction was lifted. For the first time, the House Lords could confirm the existence of ComStar battlemech forces, though the full extent of their strength would remain unknown for some years. Deploying ComGuard forces to each world of a new Federated Commonwealth required significant time and resources. Until Waterly negotiated the deal with Davian, the ComStar Guards had always been under the direct command of a Primus. Waterly found herself at the head of a logistical and administrative nightmare. Although ComStar had a battle-ready mech force since 3005, they had little experience in moving troops on a large scale or supporting them. Deploying troops to each HPG compound and setting up a costly supply system to support them took more than 2 years and required extensive outside help. For this reason, the Primus recruited several mercenary leaders as consultants to organize a vast operation, but as a result, these long-term contractors eventually learned that the largest military force in the Inner Sphere was hidden on Terra. The secrecy around ComStar started to crack. Primus Waterly held a different belief than her predecessor. She thought that dividing the Inner Sphere houses into 2 armed camps would be dangerous. Instead, she wanted to keep the Inner Sphere splintered and at each other's throat. To achieve her goal, she offered Operation Rosebud. Centerpiece for this was the Wrestlehawk district. This was a piece of a Draconis Combine at the border region to the Lyran Commonwealth. A rather unhappy destiny because it had turned into a constant war zone where raids and counter-raids inflicted casualties on the population. Furthermore, the original Scandinavian inhabitants of the old Principality of Wrestlehawk were unwilling to submit under the foreign and strange customs of a Draconis Combine. Several uprisings and riots had shaped the last 700 years of history. During the Fourth Succession War, many Wrestlhagians greeted the Lyran Commonwealth troops as liberators and helped them to capture many Wrestlehawk systems before the behavior of the Lyran Command soured this relation also. Waterly was eager to use this for ComStar's advantage. Operation Rosebud called for ComStar to sponsor movement within the Wrestlehawk worlds to win the independence from the Draconis Combine. The new Wrestlehawk state would act as a buffer between the Draconis Combine and the Federated Commonwealth, allowing the Combine to relocate its troops, currently policing Wrestlehawk, to the border of the Federated Sons. In addition, the Primus also hoped to create enough unrest in Sky for it to create its own independence movement and physically separate the Federated Sons and Lyran Commonwealth again. In September 3030, Primus Waterly secretly met with Kanray Theodore Kurita to lay the groundwork for the first phase of Rosebud. ComStar would provide the Draconis Combine with intelligence information on the Federated Commonwealth and with battlemechs from its undisclosed sources to replenish those lost during the Fourth Succession War. In return, the Combine would allow ComStar to post ComGuard troops at all of its HPG compounds and would officially recognize the formation of a free Russell Republic. However, when Waterly returned to Terra, she faced the First Circuit that was uneasy with the terms she had negotiated. To quell the debate, she assured the Council that any battle mech given to the Combine would be stripped of any lost stack devices. In 3034, Auscorita recognized the Free Russell Republic, giving up most of the worlds it had promised to ComStar. The Lyran Commonwealth equally had to surrender a considerable number of worlds won during the Fourth Succession War to the Republic, damaging the relationship between the Commonwealth and the Republic. Shortly after, both the Combine and ComStar began to question their earlier agreement. The Combine withheld several key worlds from the Free Russell Republic, keeping them in the Alshine district, and ComStar only provided stripped-down battle mechs to the DCMS, rather than the original Star League equipment Auscorita believed Waterly had promised. Sky was ablaze with demonstrations, but neither the Draconis Combine nor ComStar believed that a large-scale revolt against the Steiner-Davian Union was likely. The tensions between the Combine and ComStar reached their peak in the summer of 3034. One of the Primus traveled to Diron to meet with Theodore Kurita in the Dragon's Roost command post, hidden in the Tatsuyama Mountains. The meeting was cordial, but tense, with both sides claiming that the other had failed to uphold their end of the pact. Theodore Kurita insisted that he was unable to concede any other world to the New Republic, and Primus Waterly conceded that ComStar would not interdict the Combine for renouncing its agreement. To conclude Operation Rosebud, Kurita presented a unique gift to Primus Waterly, a former general he had captured some years ago. The Conray knew that despite ComStar's vast military machine, the troops lacked practical military experience or leadership other than that of the contracted mercenaries. By presenting this prisoner to Waterly, he gave the ComGuards a new path filled with endless possibilities. The new general would be known under the name Anastasius Vogt. Primus Waterly made him her new Presenter Rom, replacing Presenter Cassiu because of his gross incompetence during the recent dealings with the Draconis Combine, even though the Primus handled all the negotiations directly. Despite the sensitive nature of Vogt's posting, it was approved with little debate by the First Circuit. Many historians and witnesses believe that the Primus used political favors to prevent controversy over Vogt's appointment. None knew his background or opinions, and most assumed him to be simply one of the Primus followers. To tie everything together and get the most benefits out of Operation Rosebud, the Primus turned her attention to Sky. In meetings with Ryan Steiner, leader of the Sky Independence Movement, Primus Waterly agreed to provide favorite user status to Ryan and his followers in exchange for an incident. In 3041, forces loyal to Ryan Steiner car-bombed the outer perimeter wall of Ko HPG compound, killing 5 acolytes and 2 adepts while seriously wounding the presenter of the station. Using this attack as a pretext, Primus Waterly demanded that Archon Melissa Steiner, allowed her to post ComStar guards in the Commonwealth to protect the HPG stations. A full interdiction would be the result of a refusal. The Archon agreed, despite her personal resentment of the Primus and her demands. After she returned to Terra, Mundu Waterley claimed that Operation Rosebud was a success, but her detractors in the First Circuit pronounced it a failure. For them, too few of its goals were met. However, Waterley solidified her hold on the First Circuit by appointing Gardner Rees as the presenter of Rasselhag and as a new advocate member of the First Circuit. Rees had been a low-level adept in the Order before Waterley promoted him, but he was a devout follower of her extreme views and would tip the balance of the First Circuit's control in her favor. In the fall of 3034, agents working for the MIIO reported that House Gurita had access to sensitive information that could only have come from ComStar. This led Prince Hans Davian to initiate Operation Flush, a secret war between MIIO and ROM, aimed at exposing ComStar's suspected duplicity and ridding the Federated Commonwealth of all ROM agents. Also, Prince Davian believed that if he could prove that ComStar was not adhering to its claims of pacifism, he would rid the Federated Commonwealth of its current garrisons of ComStar forces. Though clandestine, Operation Flush was a bloody war. In December of 3034, MIIO operatives rounded up dozens of suspected ROM agents in sweeps on 36 worlds. Flush's opening shot. Though many of these civilians had no ties whatsoever to the Order, Hans Davian ordered them interrogated and interned. Presenter Vocht's response to Operation Flush was to wage a war of confusion against the Federated Commonwealth. Misinformation and false leaks planted by agents still operating in the FedCom led MIIO to believe that several key administrators and statespersons in the government were ROM agents. MIIO's response, after months of following the red herrings, was to begin a systematic assassination campaign against all suspected ROM agents who may have evaded the initial dragnet. Responding to a proposal by Primus Waterley, the First Circuit passed the Readjustment Act of 3035. This act reformed the ComGuards and ROM, creating the position of Presenter Marshal. The Presenter ROM post still existed, reporting now directly to the Presenter Marshal, who in turn reported to the Primus and First Circuit. Primus Waterley appointed Anastasius Vocht as a first Presenter Marshal of the ComGuards. The new Presenter ROM was Charles Seneca, formerly of the Free Worlds League. Primus Waterley's reorganization placed Vocht in direct charge of the ComGuards, a position in which she felt his unique skills would be put to the best use. On the other hand, Primus Waterley allowed Seneca to step up operation against the MIIO by using ROM as an assassination tool, resulting in a deadly game of cat and mouse between agents of both agencies, using firebombing, snipers, and booby traps. By 3044, when Prince Hans Davian decided to end Operation Flush, some 420 agents had died. The Primus claimed it was a ComStar victory, while the Federated Commonwealth claimed to have purged ROM from within its borders. In other places, things were going better for ComStar. Thomas Merrick, rise to power in the Free Worlds League, was greatly aided by Primus Waterley's new vision for ComStar. When Thomas was injured in 3035, a ROM agent named Philip Tagliabue helped him to escape from medical treatment. ComStar diverted a series of jump ships to transport Thomas to Terra. While at the Hilton Head medical facility, he met regularly with the Primus and was given full access to all transmissions from the Free Worlds League. This was an unprecedented move on the part of Primus Waterley, who saw Thomas Merrick as an opportunity to forge ties with one of the inner sphere houses like never before. After playing on Merrick's background with ComStar, the Primus had agreed to provide him with information on the condition that he would allow presenter Marshall Foch to post comm guards in the Free Worlds League when he assumed the Captain Generalcy. By the spring of 3040, Thomas Merrick solidified his powers in the Free Worlds League by capturing Dame Catherine Humphreys, ending Endurian's most recent rebellion. It was a ROM report smuggled to Thomas by presenter Atreus on orders of the Primus that made Humphreys' capture possible. Seeking to expand her ComGuard's posting to really every house, Primus Waterley visits the Compellent Confederation in 3038. During a state meeting with Chancellor Romano Yao, tensions between ComStar and the House became apparent. When Primus Waterley announced an increase of 25% in transmission rates for the Confederation, citing upgrade costs to the HPG network as the cause. Angered by the announcement, Chancellor Liao accused ComStar of exploiting her nation's already weakened economy. So, in an effort to compromise, the Primus proposed that ComStar maintain the current transmission rates for 25 years in exchange for the Capel Confederation permitting ComStar to station Battletech forces at its HPG compounds. Although Romano was initially resistant to the idea, she and Primus Waterley signed a pact within 6 months, allowing the Com Guards to garrison troops in the Confederation. But later, Chancellor Liao began to suspect that presenter Tie of Xi'an was a spy, selling state secrets to Liao's dreaded enemy, the Federated Commonwealth. The idea was mainly based on false data about presenter Tie's connections and relationship with Tormana Liao, provided by Mashkarovka agents. The Chancellor twice demanded that Primus Waterley replace the presenter, and when her requests went unheeded, she took matters in her own hands. In 3041, Mashkarovka agents attempted to assassinate presenter Tie during a motorcade tour of the capital. The presenter was wounded, but she managed to escape. The assassins were never caught, but it was discovered that they were operating on direct orders from Chancellor Liao. The Chancellor also threatened to revoke her agreement with ComStar, saying she would remove the ComGuards from her empire, with force if necessary. Waterley courteously reminded her that assassinations and threats would force ComStar to declare an interdiction of a complete confederation. This stalemate continued for 3 weeks. Discussions with presenter Marshall Foch convinced Primus Waterley that Romano Liao's mental state and her previous record for violent actions made resistance by ComStar futile. The presenter Marshall further contended that the Com Guards could win if forced to fight the Campbell military, but they would not be able to maintain control of the Confederation while defending all their other HPG sites. Though faced with a difficult situation, Primus Waterley was able to turn it to her own advantage. Rather than heading into a military confrontation with the Confederation, she opted to replace Tie with adept Jin Li as presenter Xian. The Primus cited her concern for Tie following the former presenter's recent accident as a pretext for making the change. Romano Liao was delighted with a change of personnel, especially since the Li family was a long-honored ally of House Liao, and Romano personally knew and trusted Yen Li. However, Primus Waterly considered this a victory for ComStar, as Yen Li was actually a long-time ROM operative, posing as an adept. For more than a decade, Li had been feeding ComStar informations about the inner circle of a compelling confederation, a mission that continued long after promotion to presenter. As we can see, thanks to Myondo Waterly's workings, every one of the successor states now had a garrison of com guards stationed within their own borders. After more than 2 centuries in the shadows, using manipulation trickery, ComStar had finally the ability to face their opponents head-on. The War of 3039. ComStar was aware of the looming War of 3039 well before it broke out. Primus Waterly understood the danger of House Davian's power to ComStar, and intercepted military information from the Federated Suns proved their war preparations. This information was then passed on to the Draconis Combine as per their agreement with Theodore Corita. In monitoring this information, however, both the Primus and ROM were puzzled by how few messages were sent via the HPG network. ROM postulated that either the Federated Commonwealth was using jump ship command circuits to relay information, or else they had come up with another way of transmitting their messages. Well, despite this, the initial success of the Federated Commonwealth's offensive into the Combine was short-lived, as the Conray repelled most of the Steiner Davian forces with the help of refitted ComStar battlemechs. One of the most sweeping changes that occurred the following decade was the reorganization of the ComGuards under presenter Marshal Vogt. While the ComGuards divisions followed the same essential organization as the Federated Commonwealth's regimental combat teams, they were spread out over many worlds. Using his military background, Vogt assigned troops to positions from which he could quickly reassemble his forces into larger functional units in time of need. Vogt also added supplemental infantry, ground armor support, and aerospace fighters to the Star League battlemech forces. Extensive training was implemented, preparing troops for any contingency, including anti-mech combat and combat against static defenses. While the ComGuards spread through the inner sphere, ComStar needed to avoid being perceived as a threat. So, to maintain a neutral, pacifistic image, the ComGuards were often deployed in peaceful roles, like assisting in relief efforts, hostage rescues, and search missions. One of the most successful public relation moves was the ComStar's defense of the periphery against pirate raiders. Vogt used his troops to defend several planets against raids and attacks by pirate kingdoms, but he never went out to search the bases of those raiders. This allowed the pirates to continuously exist and put a pressure on the sphere, while also be available as potential tools for ComStar's future use. At the same time, the ComGuards could present themselves as the defenders of the inner sphere and its people, beating back the pirates' time and time again. The Hollywood image of a pristine white ComGuard mech repelling the raiders also served as an excellent recruitment tool for the Order. During the years of Primus Waterly's rule, ComStar had transformed from a communication and intelligence organization into a substantial military power. The expanded and trained ComGuards were now professionally led, their organization streamlined, they were stationed in the complete Innosphere, and their numbers had multiplied. While not strong enough to fight all the other states in the sphere, ComStar had become the single biggest military power. It was now ready to enforce the word of Blake and secure the future for the Blessed Order. And then, the August of the year 3049 came. It is a rather cruel joke that the catalyst for the clan invasion was directly based on Primus Adrienne Sims' fears and worries about the well-being of the people of the sphere. As you can remember, her visions of horrific, demonic, animal-like creatures striking from periphery was the reason to organize the ComStar Explorer Corps. However, their mission to travel and cartograph the unknown reaches of the deep periphery and the great beyond turned out to be the ignition for a chain of events that would bring a new wave of untold havoc onto the Innosphere and should, in fact, end the history of ComStar as a unified organization with a clear purpose. In the summer of 3048, the Explorer Corps vessel Outbound Light jumped into clan space out of the smoked Jaguar-controlled world of Huntress. Immediately, Khan Leo Showers ordered his aerospace forces to seize the ship before it could exit the system or deploy any dropships. The crew of the vessel was taken alive and interrogated regarding their origins and the nature of their mission. The information they revealed under the influence of mind-control drugs, truth-measuring devices, and savage physical abuse gave almost all clans their first in-depth insight into the Innosphere. To make things worse, Khan Leo Showers was a radical leader of the so-called Crusader camp, those clans who insisted on returning to the sphere and subjugating all mankind under the rule of Kerensky. Therefore, Showers was the very worst person to receive this crucial information. What he learned from the Outbound Light's crew was that the Steiner-Davian Union had the Innosphere poised on the verge of forming a new Star League, without any involvement of the clans. A result that would prove the prophecies and ideals of Nicholas Kerensky, the creator of the clans, wrong. He therefore used this knowledge as a basis for initiating the clan invasion of the Innosphere a year later. The invasion, named Operation Revival by the clans, struck at the periphery with unprecedented fury. None of the pirate kingdoms or weak periphery states were even remotely prepared for an assault of the magnitude unleashed by the clans. ROM agents posted on many of these worlds managed to transmit emergency messages to Terra before communications were cut off, but none could communicate the exact nature of the attackers or their origins. The First Circuit did not know what to make out of this enemy, wielding new technology and presenting a very real threat to the Innosphere. Many feared at first that the invaders might be alien hordes, but careful analysis showed that their use of battletech technology and their language indicated they were human. When the fighting in the periphery came to a close, Primus Waterly took matters into her own hands. She recognized that it was paramount to make contact with the attackers, to learn their intentions, and to allow a more active role for ComStar. To do so, she ordered the Explorer Corps to establish lines of communication with the unknown enemy. The brave men manning the assigned ships were ordered to jump into clan-controlled space and to broadcast a request to open diplomatic dialogue. 2 of these vessels were destroyed when they failed to respond to Clan Smoke Jaguar's Bachal challenges. Finally, in November 3049, an Explorer Corps ship managed to establish contact with the clans. It was during this first encounter that ComStar learned that the clans were the descendants of General Kerensky's Exodus fleet. The clans treated the members of the Order with a certain degree of respect once they realized the similarities between the foundation of their society and ComStar's lonely struggle to preserve the true heritage of the fallen Star League. In January 3050, Primus Waterly appointed Presenter Marshal Fogg as ComStar's official ambassador to the clans. Fogg traveled to the clan occupation zone and entered into intense discussions with a new Ilkhan, Leo Showers of the Smoke Jaguars. Within 2 months, he hammered out an agreement in which ComStar agreed to cut off all military transmissions from those worlds targeted or captured by the clans. Fogg further agreed that ComStar would provide the clans with basic information on the military disposition of the great houses and information about the size, strength, and location of Inner-Sphere armed forces on worlds they planned to attack. In return, the clans promised not to interfere with ComStar's operations and to allow them to act as administrators of the worlds conquered by their invading armies. ComStar's real interest in signing the pact was to buy the Primus and the First Circuit time to learn the true goals of their enemy. The agreement allowing ComStar to administer conquered worlds also gave them access to extensive information about the clan invaders themselves. Some of the First Circuit were against Primus Waterly's plan, arguing that these actions directly violated Jerome Blake's teaching that ComStar was to remain neutral in conflicts with the Inner Sphere. But they were powerless against Primus Waterly's political machine and had to accept the new course of action. The Blessed Order would help the clans in the destruction of the Inner Sphere. In her entire career, Primus Waterly made only 2 mistakes. The first was her appointment of Anastasius Fogg to our order and to the post of Presenter Marshal. The second was making this pact with the satanic clans. These barbarians from the hinterlands very nearly succeeded in destroying our blessed order and allowed Fogg in Mori to create the rift between the word of Blake and the accused ComStar. Primus Waterly would better have served ComStar's goal by simply committing our troops to eliminating these invaders when they first appeared. The invasion came to a sudden halt when Ilkhan Leo Showers died on the 31st October 3050. A dying but determined fighter pilot from the newly formed Russellhout Republic had rammed her vessel into the bridge of the clan command ship, the Direwolf. By making the ultimate sacrifice, she also claimed the lives of the Ilkhan and a substantial portion of his command staff. His death necessitated the recall of all invading clan Khans and blood-named warriors to Strana Mehti, the capital world of the clans, to oversee the election of a new Ilkhan, which gave the Inner Sphere an extra year of preparation before the renewed assault. During this year of peace, ComStar continued to serve as the administrative arm of the clans on the conquered worlds. It was a sudden revelation that changed the situation and the behavior of all involved parties. It was the final explanation of one of the greatest mysteries the sphere had seen and Rom had failed to uncover. Colonel Jamie Wolfe of the Wolf's Dragoons invited the House leaders to meet on Outreach, the Dragoons' central station and HQ. Here, he willingly revealed the origin of his unit. The Dragoons were originally an intelligence gathering operation from the clans into the inner sphere. The conflict between the pro-return Crusaders and anti-return Wardens had haunted the clans for decades. Even before the capture of the Outbound Light, there was a growing movement to fulfill the prophecies of Kerensky, who had promised his faithful followers that after 3 generations, the clans would be able to return to the inner sphere. However, this period of clan history was, for good reason, known as the political century. So when he was pressured by Clan Ghostbear to start preparations for an invasion, Khan Curlin Ward of Clan Wolf used political measures to defuse the situation. The Dragoon Compromise was made. Instead of attacking into the unknown, a special contingent of warriors would be sent into the sphere, undercover, to collect as much intel as possible about the situation. This was the origin of the Wolf's Dragoons, and this was a reason for their advanced equipment. However, Khan Curlin Ward had double-crossed the Crusaders, and his last order had not been to prepare the invasion, but to prepare the inner sphere for the invasion. The Wolf's Dragoons would side against the clans. By opening up about these facts, Colonel Jamie Wolfe was able to convince the House Lords that working together gave the inner sphere its best chance of defeating the clans. What the Primus and the First Circuit never expected was that indeed some of the House Lords would manage to put aside the differences in the interest of survival, particularly Theodore Kurita and Hansa Davian. Even Thomas Merrick was eventually convinced to cooperate. These vital agreements would later turn the tide against the clans. ComStar's failure to step in and become the political leader of the inner sphere was noted. Most of the House Lords assumed from their absence at this meeting that ComStar was aiding the invading clans, and they openly began to distrust the order. This suspicion would eventually unravel the fabric of power that ComStar had woven and embellished over the centuries. To replace Leo Showers as Ilkhan, Ulrich Kerensky of Clan Wolf was elected. An interesting choice because he was much closer to the Wardens than to the Crusaders. But nonetheless, his reappearance in the sphere marked the beginning of a new clan offensive. ComStar still had made no progress towards discovering the location of the clan homeworlds or the invaders' true objectives. And so Primus Waterly insisted on continuing to provide the clans with military target information. In January 3052, the clans Novacat and Smoke Jaguar launched an all-out offensive against the Combine's capital world, Luthien. In an unexpected show of unity between the houses, Hansa Davian ordered the elite mercenary forces of Wolf's Dragoons and the Kellhounds to defend the planet. Even though coordinator Takashi Kurita felt deep animosity towards House Davian and the mercenaries, the additional forces tipped the scale in favor of the defenders and helped defeat the clans. It was another surprise for Primus Waterly that caught her completely off guard. She would never have assumed that Davian and Kurita would fight alongside another, and this outcome but destroyed her plans. During this year of peace, Waterly had started to plan a new strategy. She believed that the leaders of the inner sphere would never be able to work together willingly. Only the gods were strong enough to truly stop the attack and drive the clans back. Her intention was to use this leverage and force the powers of the Inner Sphere into an alliance under the control of ComStar. The Primus wanted to wait out the clan's assault and exploit them in their first moment of weakness. However, many members of the First Circuit and Presenter Marshal Vogt himself protested. The presenters who opposed the Primus insisted that ComStar's duplicity brought danger to the Order and would destroy their standing inside the sphere. But Primus Waterly dismissed their fears. In fact, she hoped to further manipulate the clans and to convince them into a coordination and cooperation with her own political agenda. To do so, Primus Waterly traveled to the clan occupation zone. In January 3052, she joined the Presenter Marshal and met the Ilkhan on the planet Satalis, recently captured from the Free Rosslard Republic. She offered the Ilkhan a great prize, a full military disposition of Tarkad, capital of the Lyran Commonwealth. Primus Waterly made this offer on her own initiative, without the permission or knowledge of the First Circuit. However, Ilkhan Kerensky rejected her offer and informed her and the Presenter Marshal that such a campaign would only divert resources from the clan's true objective, conquering Terra, the former seed of the Star League. This announcement stunned both the Presenter Marshal and the Primus. No amount of battle analysis, no degree of familiarity with the clans had led them to suspect that Terra was the invasion's main goal. Primus Waterly was forced to admit that even ComStar could not hope to control the clans. She and Presenter Marshal Vogt spent the time traveling back to Terra, outlining a course of action against their newly discovered enemies. When the First Circuit learned the clan's true objective, they called for an immediate end to administrating the clan-held worlds. Some presenters even demanded an all-out military response. Primus Waterly, however, pointed out that remaining faithful to ComStar's pact with the clans was a necessary part of a carefully crafted answer to defend Terra and to defeat the invaders. The Presenter Marshal then outlined how the Comgirls would battle the clans for control of Terra by using a proxy world. Using the vast resources of ComStar's archives and his own knowledge of military strategy, the Presenter Marshal had to choose a world suitable to be a battlefield, or more specifically, several worlds, in case that the Ilkhan would reject his preferred one. I based my selection of Tukait as a proxy for Terra on a variety of statistics and characteristics that pointed to the world as an excellent choice. My study of clan tactics showed that the key to defeating the clans was simply to wear down our opponents over a period of time, and Tukait made it possible to conduct such a campaign. Knowing that the Ilkhan might reject Tukait as the venue for our conflict, perhaps suspecting a trap, I chose two alternatives. My second choice was the planet Jaffe in the Federated Commonwealth. The most difficult hurdle to using that planet would be asking Prince Davian and Arkensteiner to grant this favor. Even Primus Waterly might balk at the prospect. My third choice was the last resort. I knew that the Ilkhan's upbringing and heritage might force him to choose to fight on Terra itself. If that worst-case scenario came to pass, I targeted the South American continent as the site of our battle. Ilkhan Ulrich Kerensky accepted without question my choice of Tukait as a battle site between the Comguards and the clans. So, Tukait, in the remains of the Free Republic, was to be the proxy world. Varied terrain and a small civilian population, as well as its proximity to the clan front lines, convinced Presenter Marshal Vogt that Tukait was the best choice. Primus Waterly sent presentaries to meet with the exiled government of a Free Russelhawk Republic to negotiate for the use of a planet. His mission was a success. The FRR Parliament welcomed the opportunity to provide the site for the Inner Sphere's final victory over the clan forces. Just as they had kept their involvement with the clans a secret, ComStar attempted to keep their plan to deliver the Inner Sphere from the clan menace a secret also. After all, how could ComStar explain the knowledge of the clan plans without admitting its complicity? ComStar evacuated Tukait's civilian population slowly to arouse the least possible interest with the House intelligence organizations. The entire operation to engage the clans in one definitive battle would have been accomplished in secrecy were it not for the presenters Tarkat and New Avalon to leak information about ComStar's plan to the Federated Commonwealth. A breach of commitment that would have been unthinkable in the ComStar of the past. Both sides in the battle agreed to the following terms. If Tukait fell to the clans, ComStar would become one with them. Vogt pledged that ComStar would serve as administrators to the clan worlds, ceasing providing HPG services to successor states, and to relinquish Terra to the victors. If the clans won, they would in one instant gain all tools to forge a new Star League. However, if the ComGuards defeated the clans, the Ilkhan agreed to restrict his forces to the already conquered worlds, restraining the clans from seizing territories closer to Terra than a line drawn at Tukait for 15 years. Because the clans struck this bargain with ComStar, honor did not prevent them from attacking other worlds above the line. The houses of the Inner Sphere still had to contend with the clans. Vogt bid 50 battle-mech regiments of ComGuards to defend 12 cities of Tukait, committing all but a token number of his total army to the battle. In addition, Vogt also bid to add artillery, air, and infantry support to his forces. Each of his clans involved in the invasion would attack 2 cities on the planet. The winner would be the side with the highest score of controlled objectives. The 2 leaders decided to join battle on May 1st, 3052, and the ComGuards, already mobilized, immediately began to deploy on Tukait, even before the Presenter Marshal returned to Sandhurst. The Presenter Marshal spent countless hours studying the tapes of battles between the clans and various Inner Sphere forces, and felt confident that he knew the one weakness of the clan fighting style. He was determined to exploit this weak spot during the battle for Tukait. Vogt knew that their fighting philosophy consisted of quick, conclusive attacks and short-term assaults. The clans stuck quickly and counted on fast victories, removing any need for the support necessary to conduct a long-term campaign. Vogt planned his defense carefully. He stockpiled enough repair pods and ammunition to supply his troops for more than a month. By using his forces to harass the clans, rather than to commit into a direct confrontation, he hoped to prolong the battle for Tukait beyond the clan's capacity to support such an operation. The clan force's greatest advantage going into the battle was their combat experience. Though Vogt's ComGuards had been trained for combat for decades, they had never experienced war. The Presenter Marshal attempted to make up for that lack of experience by coordinating the battle from a deep bunker, outfitted with Star League tech.
We are approaching Tukait, an hour of truth draws near. During these past months, you have all received innumerable briefings. Now that battle is about to be joined, I urge you to remember the following vital tactics. The clans have an enormous technological advantage, which we must negate whenever and wherever we can. When triggering an ambush, wait until the last second before springing the trap. For the mechs, and vehicles assigned to ambush the clans. We have placed a premium on firepower at the expense of range and movement. Therefore, your opening salvo will be your best and perhaps only chance to devastate the enemy. Strike with everything you have. After your first volley, the clans will use their superior mobility to fight at a range advantage to them. You will only get one good shot. Do not waste it. When engaging the enemy in a running battle, choose swift vehicles with long-range weapons. Avoid bogging down in a stationary engagement. Force the clans to use up as much power and ammunition fighting you off as you possibly can. If you can keep the clans in the field long enough, they will run out of ammunition and vital supplies. Accustomed as they are to quick victories, a long campaign will also eat away at their morale. Your skill and bravery are beyond question, but the enemy also fights with skill and courage. In this battle, discipline will determine the victor. Remember that, and we can win the day.
The battle began as planned on May the 1st, 3052. The last clan, Clan Wolf, hit their landing zone 5 days later. We will here not describe the Battle of Tukait. You probably already know the events so well that it would be pointless to expand them further. The important thing is the outcome. After 21 days of fighting, the Ilkhan of the clans conceded victory to ComStar. Only Clan Wolf successfully gained control of both target cities. Clan Ghostbear held one objective but failed to take the second. Based on the surviving forces, Clan Jade Falcon achieved a draw. Both sides suffered huge losses. It soon became apparent that Tukait represented much more than the largest military battle in 3 centuries. The Com Guards ended the conflict with nearly 40% dead, and more than that number injured. Smoke Jaguar suffered the highest losses on the clan side, with 32% dead. Clan Wolf lost only 20% of its forces on Tukait. But at the same time, Primus Waterly had her own little operation going on. While the Presenter Marshal met with the Ilkhan to bid for the battle, Primus Waterly unfolded a plan of her own, which she dubbed Operation Scorpion. It depended on those forces left administering the HPGs in the clan occupation zone to rise up in rebellion against the clans and to retake control of those worlds. But the heart of the plan, however, was a ComStar interdiction of every house, which would throw the entire inner sphere into confusion and remind the house lords how heavily they depended on ComStar's services. Then, in return for concessions, ComStar would restore services to each successor state as they agreed to use the organization as their government's administrative arm. Primus Waterly intended for ComStar to emerge from Operation Scorpion in complete control of the inner sphere, as the Presenter Marshal defeated the clan military. If successful, ComStar would become the leading power of the inner sphere, a return to the old days of the Star League, now under new management. Meanwhile, the clans would be still present, a necessary threat to force the houses into cooperation, but their position would be severely weakened by the losses on Tukait and the rebellions in the occupation zones. ComStar would lead its new league to crush them and then start a new golden age of technology and progress, just like Blessed Blake and Saintly Toyama predicted. The Blessed Order would completely fulfill its destiny and purpose. Operation Scorpion was potentially the greatest achievement of ComStar, the ultimate fulfillment of Blake's prophecy. The weak and tainted fools who eventually turned against us betrayed the Primus and her plan, preventing ComStar from uniting all the inner sphere under the common banner of a new Star League, led by ComStar. Waterly completed the preliminary stages of Operation Scorpion without the knowledge of the First Circuit or the Presenter Marshal. She met with her supporters, covertly in a hotel outside Hilton Head Island, accompanied by a cadre of loyal ROM operatives who pledged their services to the Primus personally and ensured that the presenter marshal remained ignorant of the plan. While not present at the meeting, Waterley's hand-picked heir to the position of Primus, presenter Sharila Mori, knew of the Primus' plans early on. To play her own game and acting on ulterior loyalties, she sent the details of Operation Scorpion to Theodore Kurita, who passed the information to the Federated Commonwealth in partial repayment for Hans Davian's assistance in defending Lufien. Operation Scorpion was doomed long before it started. Primus Waterley launched Operation Scorpion as the Smoke Jaguars landed on Tukait. While the presenter marshal faced the clans, the Primus secretly faced two enemies at once: the occupying clan forces and the houses of the Inner Sphere. She called together the First Circuit and announced the full interdiction of the Inner Sphere by her right as Primus. She ordered all ComStar HPG compounds to comply with the interdiction protocol and post security forces to deal with local resistance. HPG techs and ComStar forces on clan-occupied worlds received additional orders, instructing them to engage all clan occupation forces and recapture clan-held planets in the name of the Order. She believed that one swift, bold stroke could fulfill Jerome Blake's will and visions. With the Draconis Combine and the Federated Commonwealth warned in advance, these two governments were able to take control of most of the HPGs in the realms, even before the interdiction order arrived. To make things worse, several members of the First Circuit, believing that Primus Waterley's orders went against the very nature and will of ComStar, ordered their own adepts and presenters to disobey the command. Because ComStar had not given any explanation for the interdiction, the House propaganda had no problem painting ComStar as a corrupt organization that was betraying mankind to the clans. As a result, the local population on many worlds in the Federated Commonwealth rushed the HPG compounds and took them over, sometimes at the urging of MIIO or low-key operatives. The Capellan Confederation and the Free Worlds League bore the brunt of the interdiction, because their First Circuit representatives were less sympathetic to them. The Order stunned newly appointed Chancellor Sun Tzu Liao, who personally ordered several regiments to surround key ComStar facilities and cut them off from all supplies and local communications. On several important worlds, Liao lawless troops seized the HPG stations and captured their staff, careful to take prisoners. Only Captain General Thomas Merrick showed little concern at the onset of the order. As a former member of ComStar, he believed that the Primus and the First Circuit would only order an interdiction with good reason. So Thomas Merrick simply pressed his commercial jump ships into service as a command circuit to relay any commands. But Operation Scorpion failed most stunningly in the clan occupation zone. Because most of ComStar's and the clan's military forces were fighting on Tukait, the battle to control the worlds became a slow tug of war. ComStar initially held the upper hand in rebellions because the clans did not expect their dishonorable betrayal, but the clan forces had more troops on the occupied worlds. It quickly became apparent that the clans transmitted messages through ComStar as a condition of the agreement, not from necessity. On the handful of worlds that ComStar even briefly recaptured and held, Apollo, Raus, Colmar, Löwen, Dawn, Goito, Bangor, Schwarz, and Iris, the clans set up portable HPGs. Within 8 days of the beginning of Operation Scorpion, all clan-held worlds were back in contact with their leaders above Tukait, and by the time the battle ended, the clans again controlled every world they occupied. Operation Scorpion was a complete failure. Many of ComStar's facts are simple exaggerations. On Reese, for example, elements of a ComGuard infantry garrison harassed the clan forces from the forests of Frisco until June 22nd, also managing to liberate the DCMS garrison forces imprisoned in the Kindu Reformatory during that time, further upsetting the Novaket defenders. On Apollo, it took the 7th Falcon Regulars more than 10 weeks to track down the ComStar light ground armor forces, which hounded the Falcons in the Dolly Gray Mountains for weeks without supplies or support. The bravery of those men and women who carried out Operation Scorpion will not be forgotten, nor can the betrayal of their spirit by a corrupt few be forgiven. The final statistics of Operation Scorpion told the tale. In the Federated Commonwealth, ComStar controlled only 22% of the HPGs. In the Draconis Combine, ComStar held only 80% of its installations. In the Compelled Confederation, ComStar maintained control of 70% of its compounds. The Free Russellhawk Republic and the Free Worlds League came closest to suffering the full impact of the ill-fated interdiction, with ComStar controlling 99% of the Russellhawk stations, minus the Tukait HPG, and 90% of the League stations. When Presenter Marshal Vogt discovered the Primus' duplicity, he arranged for a hand-picked emissary to ensure that Terra's own defenders, Ryan's Legion, stayed loyal to himself. After returning to Terra, he met with Presenter Mori, and together they convinced Primus Waterly to resign her post. This is one of the most vicious lies of the new ComStar order. Presenter Marshal Vogt killed Primus Waterly in cold blood without even giving her a chance to defend herself. After taking power, the Presenter Marshal placed all members of the First Circuit into protective custody to ensure their safety in the unrest that followed. During that period of several weeks, Vogt was visited by a vision of Jerome Blake. The image led him to a cornerstone in the Hall of History, where he found a copy of a technical readout written by Jerome Blake himself. In the preface, dated later than the journals that formed the core of ComStar beliefs, several passages clearly stated that ComStar was supposed to spread knowledge instead of holding it secret. The discovery of Blake's further writing shook the First Circuit and the very foundation of the order. The Presenter Marshal realized that these new revelations must immediately be passed throughout the order, and that ComStar needed to undertake major changes to live up to the words Blake left behind. Jerome Blake never wanted all the years of devotion. He created ComStar to spread technological enlightenment to all mankind, to prevent the Dark Age from emerging by joining humans to the technology they needed for a better life. Power-hungry Primuses had corrupted ComStar's true direction. And so ends the story of the original Blessed Order. Of course, it would be possible to pretend that ComStar survived the 6th of June 3052, Primus Waterly's day of death and resignation. That it remained the same organization it was, but that would be a sham, a lie. If examined carefully and without bias, it becomes clear that Vogt murdered Waterly and then used a propaganda story to set the order on a new way. A way that was more in line with the interests of the great houses. You may have little sympathy for an organization that relied to such an extent on assassination, manipulation, and lies, like the old ComStar. But it was at best dubious to change this organization by using assassination, manipulation, and lies. The reforms of Presenter Marshal Focht and Sharila Mori, the new primus, would completely change the very nature of ComStar. It no longer was the driven order with a divine mission of saving mankind from itself. Instead, it became an army with an attached communications department. It would never again reach the same importance and power it once had. Instead, it became a minor player, always dependent on other forces to set the agenda. Yes, it would run the HPG network and continue to do so wide into the 32nd century, but it would do so at the orders of the great houses, not as an independent party. Its last remnants would get annihilated in 3141, never to rise again. In a way, the fate of Comster proved that the dying Jerome Blake was right all along. To stay secure and true, Comster had to become the Blessed Order. It needed a purpose beyond being a department of communications. Vogt had not destroyed this mission, he had just separated it from the organization. Enraged by the sudden death of Waterley, the flimsy explanations, and the blatant lies, several key members of ComStar refused to follow the new leadership. With Presenter Atrius, Demona Assis's figurehead, they would break away and form their own faction. They left behind the original assets of ComStar, the industries of Terra, and the majority of the HPG network. They would leave with a substantial amount of com guards, the men and women that had fought under the command of Vogt, and for their belief in Blake. They now had to decide where their loyalties truly were. It was quite considerate of the renegades to also remove the elements that no longer had a place in ComStar. The vast majority of ROM, with its killers, enforcers, and agents, joined them in exile. However, the most important thing they kept were the teachings of Blake and Toyama. They were true believers in neither their will nor their convictions would falter. They would carry on to fulfill the destiny assigned to them by Blake himself, and it would give them strength to do the impossible and the unthinkable. They too would fall, but it would not be a slow fade away with a rotten death. They would go down in a blaze of glory. But they were no longer ComStar. They were the word of Blake.